Beneath the sands of the Nile, something still refuses to be explained. For over 5,000 years, Egypt has guarded secrets that even its own priests feared to write down. Tombs sealed not just to protect treasure, but to contain something else. Hieroglyphs that describe events historians can't verify. Structures aligned with a precision we still can't fully replicate. What did the ancients know that we've forgotten? Why were certain chambers bricked shut and never reopened? And what really happened in the years historians call the silence? So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the mysteries Egypt never wanted us to find. In the dim halls of the Museum of Cairo, among thousands of artifacts pulled from the Egyptian sand, there is no Book of Thoth. No papyrus bears that title. No sealed case holds its pages. And yet for over 2,000 years, people have spoken of it as though they had seen it themselves. The god Thoth was, to the ancient Egyptians, the architect of language itself. Ibis-headed, deliberate, precise. He was credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and the sacred rites of magic. If the gods kept records, surely Thoth kept the deepest ones. And so a belief took root. Somewhere, in some form, there existed a book written by his own hand, containing knowledge no mortal was meant to possess. The earliest whispers come from Egyptian folklore itself, long before Greek or Roman writers touched the idea. In the story known today as Setna and the Book of Thoth, a prince named Setna hears of a book buried with a prince long dead. A book that could let a man understand the speech of animals, see the gods themselves, and read the secrets of the earth. Setna finds it. He takes it. And he is punished for his arrogance, forced to return what was never his to hold. Is this simply a cautionary tale, a piece of moral fiction meant to warn against the hunger for forbidden knowledge? Most Egyptologists believe so. The story reads like a parable, not a historical account. And yet, the detail with which it describes the book's power, its location, its guardians, it lingers in the mind longer than fiction usually does. By the time the Greeks arrived in Egypt, the myth had transformed. Thoth became conflated with Hermes, and from that fusion emerged Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great, a legendary sage said to have authored a vast body of esoteric texts. The Hermetica, as they came to be called, would go on to shape alchemy, astrology, and occult philosophy for centuries across the Mediterranean world. Were these texts a continuation of something older, or an entirely Greek invention wearing an Egyptian mask? Scholars remain divided, and the honest answer may be both, tangled together beyond separation. Then there are the fringes of the theory, the places mainstream history won't follow, but where the myth still grows. Some point to the unexcavated chambers beneath the Sphinx, suggesting a hidden library sealed beneath Giza's bedrock. Others connect the Book of Thoth to the legend of the Emerald Tablets, or to lost Atlantean knowledge said to have survived a great flood. None of this is verified. None of it has physical evidence. But the persistence of the idea, across so many centuries and so many cultures, raises its own quiet question. Why does this particular myth refuse to fade? Perhaps it is simply the appeal of forbidden knowledge, a story every civilization tells in one form or another. Or perhaps the Egyptians encoded something real into their myths, a memory of a body of knowledge that once existed and was later lost, scattered, or deliberately destroyed. The burning of the Library of Alexandria alone erased an unknown quantity of ancient texts. What else was lost with it? What else, perhaps, still waits beneath the sand, uncatalogued, unopened, unread? No one has found the Book of Thoth. Perhaps no one ever will. But the question it leaves behind is harder to bury than any tomb. If the ancients believed such knowledge was too dangerous for mortal hands, what exactly did they think we would find? If the Book of Thoth teaches us that some knowledge was written down and simply lost, the story of Ra's secret name teaches us something stranger still, that some knowledge was never meant to be written at all. Picture a temple wall at Edfu, one of the best preserved sacred sites in all of Egypt. its stone surfaces covered edge to edge with inscriptions so dense they seemed to breathe with meaning. Here, among hymns and ritual instructions, the priests recorded the names of the gods, dozens of them for Ra alone. Ra the falcon-headed, Ra who sails the solar bark across the sky each day, Ra who battles the serpent Apophis each night in the darkness beneath the world. And yet, among all these titles, one name is conspicuously absent, not forgotten, not lost to time, deliberately withheld. The ancient Egyptians believed a name was not simply a label. A name was an anchor between the physical and the divine, a key that granted access to the very essence of the thing it described. To know a being's true name was to hold power over it. This was not poetic metaphor to them. It was operative magic, woven into medical spells, protective charms, and curses alike. And if this was true for any name, it was true most of all for the name of the Sun God himself, the source of all creation, the one whose secret identity even the other gods were said not to know. The most detailed account of this mystery comes to us from a papyrus, now known as the Turin Papyrus, dated to the time of Ramesses V, though the story it tells is almost certainly far older, passed down through generations before it was ever written down. In it, the goddess Isis, clever, ambitious, unwilling to remain in the shadow of her fellow deities, decides she will not settle for being merely powerful. She wants to be supreme, and to achieve this, she needs the one piece of knowledge Ra has never shared with anyone, his true, hidden name. So she sets a trap. Ra, by this point in the myths, is depicted as aging, his strength diminishing, his saliva dropping to the earth as he walks. Isis gathers this saliva and mixes it with dust, forming a serpent, which she places directly in Ra's path. The god is bitten. The venom burns through him unlike anything he has ever felt, because this poison was born partly from his own essence, and no remedy he commands can cure it. In his agony, he calls together the other gods, but none of them can help him either. Only Isis offers a cure, and her price is simple. Tell me your true name, and I will heal you. Ra resists. He offers her a litany of his known names and titles, hoping to satisfy her without surrendering the one name that matters. But the pain does not relent, and eventually, weakened beyond endurance, Ra relents as well. He whispers his secret name to Isis, and with that knowledge, she heals him, and gains a form of power that, according to the myth, would elevate her among the gods from that day forward. The story ends there, at least in the text we have. Ra's true name is never written into the papyrus. The scribe who recorded this myth for the priesthood of Ramesses V's era, whoever they were, either did not know it or knew better than to commit it to writing. And that omission is, in itself, part of what has kept this mystery alive for thousands of years. Mainstream Egyptology treats the myth as a religious narrative explaining the transfer and diffusion of divine power, common in a pantheon where gods were not static but constantly negotiating status among themselves. It's a compelling explanation, and it fits comfortably within what we know of Egyptian theology. But it does not fully answer the more unsettling question underneath it. Why would a civilization so devoted to recording, preserving, and inscribing knowledge onto stone meant to last millennia choose, deliberately, to leave one specific piece of information out? Some researchers point to comparisons with other ancient cultures that guarded true names as sacred secrets, a pattern that appears in various forms across the ancient world, suggesting this wasn't a uniquely Egyptian anxiety, but something closer to a shared, ancient instinct about the power of language itself. Others, working further from the accepted historical record, have speculated that the true name wasn't a name in the way we understand it at all, that it may have represented a concept, a sound, or a piece of knowledge about the nature of creation that the priesthood considered too dangerous to be widely known, encoded into myth precisely so that it would never be written plainly. There is no evidence for this second possibility. It cannot be tested, measured, or verified through any archaeological method available to us. But it persists, quietly, alongside the more grounded academic reading, because the silence at the center of this myth is unusually specific. Ancient Egyptian religious texts rarely shy away from detail. They catalog, they enumerate, they name, and in this one case, involving the most powerful deity in their entire cosmology, they chose not to. So the question remains, as it has for thousands of years. Was Ra's name simply a myth's narrative device, a story about power changing hands among the gods? Or was it something else, something the priests of Edfu and beyond genuinely believed should never be spoken aloud, let alone carved into stone where anyone might read it? We may never know which explanation is correct. Perhaps that uncertainty was the entire point. If Ra's secret name shows us a mystery hidden in plain sight, carved everywhere except the one place it mattered, the next chapter takes us somewhere far more literal, beneath the ground itself, into a space that archaeologists confirm exists, but whose true purpose still resists explanation. Beneath the causeway connecting the Great Sphinx to the Valley Temple at Giza, sealed for centuries beneath tons of limestone and sand, lies a vertical shaft. It descends nearly 100 feet into the bedrock, straight down, in 3 distinct levels, each one revealing something stranger than the last. Today, archaeologists call it the Osiris Shaft. And what was found inside it, when it was finally cleared in the late 20th century, left even seasoned Egyptologists uncertain how to categorize it. The shaft had been known in some form since the 19th century, when early explorers noted its opening, but lacked the means or the will to fully excavate it. It wasn't until 1999, under the direction of renowned Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, that a team finally pumped out the groundwater that had flooded its lowest chamber for millennia and descended to see what lay at the bottom. The first level is unremarkable by Giza's standards, a series of rough-cut rooms, probably used at some point for burials, showing signs of activity from multiple periods of Egyptian history layered atop one another. It's the second and third levels that defy easy explanation. At the second level, the shaft opens into a chamber dominated by a massive rectangular sarcophagus carved directly from the bedrock, surrounded by a moat-like trench that would have been filled with water, creating the image of an island encircled by water in perpetual darkness. This is not incidental design. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris, god of the afterlife, ruler of the dead, murdered and dismembered by his brother Set before being resurrected by Isis, was closely associated with imagery of an island surrounded by the primordial waters of creation. Scholars who have studied the shaft believe this chamber was constructed specifically to symbolize the tomb of Osiris himself, not as a literal burial site for a pharaoh, but as a ritual space representing the death and rebirth of the god at the very heart of Giza's necropolis. That alone would be a remarkable find. But it is the shaft's date that complicates the picture. The tools, techniques, and layout suggest the chamber was cut sometime during the 26th dynasty, roughly the 7th century BC, more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx were built. Why would a civilization, 2 millennia removed from the age of the pyramid builders, dig 100 feet into the bedrock beneath one of its oldest and most sacred sites to construct a symbolic tomb for Osiris? What made this specific location, beneath this specific causeway, the place where that ritual needed to happen? Mainstream Egyptology offers a reasonably grounded answer. By the time of the 26th dynasty, Giza had already become an object of reverence and restoration for a civilization looking back at its own ancient past, much as we look back at Giza today. Priests of that era were known to have taken a strong interest in reviving old religious practices and honoring ancestral monuments, and the construction of an Osiris shrine at Giza would fit within a broader pattern of religious revivalism happening across Egypt at the time. It's a coherent explanation, supported by comparable projects elsewhere from the same period. And yet questions remain that this explanation doesn't fully settle. Why go to the effort of digging nearly 100 feet down, through solid bedrock, rather than building a shrine at the surface, as was done elsewhere? Why place it precisely along the causeway axis connecting the Sphinx to the pyramids, a location already saturated with meaning far older than the 26th dynasty itself? And why does the third and final level of the shaft, the deepest chamber cut even further into the rock, remain to this day without a fully agreed upon interpretation? This is where the fringes of the theory begin. Some researchers, working well outside conventional academic channels, have proposed that the Osiris shaft is not a creation of the 26th dynasty at all, but a far older structure that was simply reused and modified during that period. Evidence, they argue, of construction techniques and knowledge inherited from a civilization predating even the pyramid builders. Others have pointed to the shaft's alignment and depth as suggestive of a deliberate connection to the pyramids above, part of a larger underground network beneath the plateau that has never been fully mapped. None of these theories are accepted by mainstream Egyptology, and no physical evidence has confirmed them. But the shaft's genuine strangeness, its depth, its symbolism, its precise placement, leaves room for these questions to persist rather than dissolve. What we know for certain is this: somebody, at some point in Egypt's long history, felt compelled to carve a symbolic grave for the god of death and resurrection into the bedrock beneath the most sacred ground in the ancient world, and to do it in near total darkness, far from any eyes that might witness the work. Was it an act of devotion, a restoration of something older, or a ritual whose true purpose was never meant to be understood by those outside its priesthood? The Osiris shaft remains open for tours today, dimly lit, quiet, and largely unexplained. One of the few mysteries at Giza you can actually walk down into. What still waits at the bottom of that darkness, beyond what has already been found? Every letter left at a tomb, every offering set before a stela, carries an assumption that someone on the other side is still listening. It's a short step from that belief to something far more deliberate, not just hoping the dead might hear you, but making certain they answer. Among the tens of thousands of papyrus fragments recovered from Egypt and now scattered across museum collections worldwide, a small and unsettling category stands apart from hymns, tax records, and medical texts. These are the magical papyri, spellbooks essentially, compiled largely during the Greco-Roman period of Egyptian history, though many scholars believe they preserve techniques and formulas passed down from far older, purely Egyptian traditions. Among the spells for love, healing, and protection, there exists a smaller, more guarded set of texts concerned with something else entirely: compelling the dead to speak. The practice had a name in the ancient world: necromancy, derived from Greek roots meaning divination through the dead. But long before the Greeks arrived in Egypt and began documenting what they found, the Egyptians themselves had already developed their own methods of communicating with those who had passed beyond the veil. The most well-documented of these is the practice of writing letters to the dead, a custom with evidence stretching back to the Old Kingdom, over 4,000 years ago. Grieving family members would inscribe messages onto bowls, stele, or papyrus, addressed directly to a deceased relative, asking for help, protection, or intervention in the affairs of the living. These letters were left at tombs or offering chapels, under the belief that the dead retained awareness and influence in the world they had left behind, and could be petitioned much like a god. This much is verified, documented, and accepted by mainstream Egyptology without controversy. It reflects a broader Egyptian worldview in which death was not a severing, but a transition, and the boundary between the living and the dead remained permeable, communicable, and in some cases, negotiable. It is in the later magical papyri, however, that the practice grows considerably darker. Texts such as the Greek magical papyri, compiled in Egypt during the Roman period but drawing on far older Egyptian magical frameworks, contain detailed instructions for rituals intended not merely to petition the dead, but to summon and bind their spirits into active service, compelling them to reveal hidden knowledge, deliver prophecies, or act on behalf of the living for specific ends. Some of these rituals called for offerings left at tombs during specific lunar phases. Others involved the ritual use of items associated with the deceased, operating on the same principle that gave names their power in Egyptian magic more broadly. A fragment of the dead was believed to retain a connection to the whole and could serve as a channel to reach them. Why does this matter? Beyond historical curiosity. Because these practices existed in direct tension with Egypt's official religious structure. The priesthood, the temples, and the state maintained careful control over the proper channels of communication with the divine and the dead, funerary rites, temple offerings, sanctioned prayers. Necromantic practice, by contrast, operated outside those channels, often privately, sometimes in secrecy, occasionally at the edges of what the state considered acceptable. Some scholars argue this points to a two-tiered religious reality in ancient Egypt: an official temple-sanctioned theology recorded on monuments for eternity, and a separate, less visible tradition of private magical practice that rarely made it into the historical record precisely because it wasn't meant to. How much of this private tradition has been lost entirely, simply because it was never inscribed on stone, never meant to outlive its practitioners? We may never know. What has survived comes to us largely by accident. Papyri preserved in Egypt's dry climate, tucked away in tombs, or buried in temple libraries that were abandoned rather than destroyed. For every fragment that survived, how many others crumbled, burned, or were deliberately destroyed by those who considered the knowledge too dangerous to preserve? This is where the fringe theories begin to take hold, in the gaps left by what we don't have rather than what we do. Some researchers working outside mainstream Egyptology have suggested that certain tomb designs, particularly the elaborate trap systems, false passages, and sealed inner chambers found in various Old and Middle Kingdom tombs, may have served a dual purpose beyond simply deterring thieves, preventing the kind of ritual access that necromantic practitioners would have required to reach a body or its associated grave goods. It's a theory without direct textual confirmation, but it isn't entirely implausible given how seriously the Egyptians treated the vulnerability of the dead to outside interference. Others point to persistent local traditions, recorded by later Arab and medieval travelers visiting Egypt, describing sites where locals still refuse to approach certain tombs after dark, citing beliefs about restless spirits bound to those locations by rituals performed centuries or millennia earlier. These accounts are folklore, filtered through generations of retelling, and cannot be verified against the original practices they claim to describe. But their persistence, layered onto genuinely ancient magical traditions, raises a familiar question. At what point does a folk memory become a historical echo of something real? What we're left with is a fragmented picture: verified letters to ancestors on one end, elaborate binding spells for the dead on the other, and an unknown quantity of private ritual practice lost somewhere in between. The Egyptians clearly believed the dead could be reached. The question that remains, echoing through every surviving fragment, is simpler and harder to answer. Reached for what purpose? And by whom? And what, if anything, ever truly answered back? There's a question we haven't asked yet, and it's overdue. Who were the people writing all of this down in the first place? The letters to the dead, the guarded name of Ra, the magical papyri hidden away from casual eyes. Someone had to be trained to produce them. Somewhere, that training happened. And the place where it happened had a name: the House of Life. The Per-Ankh, as it was known in ancient Egyptian, doesn't survive today in any single identifiable structure the way the pyramids or Karnak's temples do. No tour bus stops at the House of Life, and yet we know it existed, not as legend, but as a documented institution, referenced in inscriptions, administrative records, and the colophons of surviving papyri attached to major temple complexes at sites including Abydos, Amarna, and Esna. Archaeological remains believed to correspond to a House of Life have been identified at Amarna, dating to the reign of Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, giving us one of our few physical glimpses into what such a place may have actually looked like. On the surface, the House of Life functioned as something between a library, a scriptorium, and a school. It was here that scribes were trained, medical texts were composed and copied, religious literature was preserved, and, crucially, new ritual and magical texts were produced under priestly supervision. The famous Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest known surgical treatises in human history, is believed to have originated from an institution like this. So is the Ebers Papyrus, a sprawling compilation of medical knowledge and remedies that reveals a surprisingly systematic, observational approach to the human body, layered alongside spells and incantations meant to accompany treatment. Medicine and magic in the House of Life were not separate disciplines. They were two expressions of the same underlying goal: restoring order to a body or a situation that had fallen into disorder. This much sits comfortably within the mainstream historical record. Where the House of Life becomes more difficult to fully map is in what it meant to actually work there. What oaths were taken, what knowledge was restricted to which rank of priest-scribe, and what, precisely, separated the texts meant for general temple use from those meant to stay within the walls of the institution itself. Some inscriptions hint at hierarchy within the House of Life that went beyond ordinary scribal training. Titles such as Chief of Secrets appear in association with these institutions, suggesting the existence of restricted knowledge accessible only to specific individuals who had earned, inherited, or been granted the right to it. What exactly qualified as a secret in this context? Egyptologists generally interpret this in ritual terms: knowledge of specific temple rites, the correct performance of embalming procedures, or the proper recitation of protective formulas during sensitive ceremonies. This is a reasonable, well-supported reading, consistent with how restricted religious knowledge functioned across many ancient priesthoods, not only in Egypt. But the House of Life's association with both medicine and magic raises a harder question that mainstream scholarship has not fully resolved. How much of what was practiced and recorded within these walls has simply not survived? Papyrus, for all its durability in Egypt's dry climate, is still an organic material, vulnerable to fire, flooding, insects, and the simple passage of time. The libraries attached to temples were not immune to destruction during periods of war, religious upheaval, or foreign conquest. The reign of Akhenaten alone, during which the Amarna House of Life apparently operated, was followed by a religious backlash so severe that his name was struck from monuments and his capital abandoned. What happened to the texts being produced there in the years just before that collapse? Some fragments have been recovered. How many others were lost when the city itself was deliberately dismantled by his successors? This is where more speculative interpretations begin to surface, mostly outside conventional academic channels. A number of alternative researchers have proposed that the House of Life served, at least in some periods, as a repository for knowledge considered too advanced, too dangerous, or too destabilizing for public religious life. Knowledge that may have included astronomical data, engineering techniques, or medical procedures beyond what survives in the texts we currently have access to. There is no confirmed evidence for this specific claim, and most Egyptologists would consider it a significant overreach beyond what the House of Life's known function actually supports. But the institution's genuine role as a guarded center of specialized knowledge, combined with the very real gaps in what has physically survived, leaves room for the question to persist rather than close cleanly. We know the House of Life existed. We know it trained the minds responsible for much of what we now consider ancient Egyptian science, medicine, and ritual literature. What we don't know, what we may never fully know, is how much of what passed through its doors never made it into the historical record at all. Every papyrus that survived to reach a museum shelf represents, by definition, a fragment of something larger. How large, and how much of it remains buried, unread, in a temple library we haven't yet found. We keep returning to the same idea: a threshold somewhere in Egypt where the ordinary world gives way to something else. The House of Life guarded its threshold behind scribal training and priestly rank. But at Abydos, the threshold wasn't metaphorical at all. The Egyptians themselves called it a gateway, and they meant it literally. Abydos sits roughly 300 miles south of Cairo, along the Nile's western bank, and it may be the single most sacred site in all of ancient Egypt, more sacred in the minds of the Egyptians themselves than Giza or even Thebes. This was not primarily a city for the living. It was a city built around death, memory, and the mythology of Osiris, and it held that role for close to 3,000 years of continuous religious use, one of the longest unbroken sacred traditions anywhere in the ancient world. At the heart of Abydos stands the Temple of Seti the Fir, completed by his son Rameses II around the 13th century BC, its interior walls covered in some of the most precisely carved reliefs to survive from ancient Egypt. It's here that you'll find the so-called Abydos King List, a carved genealogy naming 76 pharaohs in succession, an invaluable, verified historical document that has helped modern Egyptologists reconstruct the order of Egypt's early dynasties. This part of Abydos is squarely mainstream, thoroughly documented and essential to how we understand Egyptian chronology today. But behind the Temple of Setian, lies something else entirely, something that has generated far more speculation than any king list ever could. The Osiris. Sunk below the surrounding ground level, built from massive, roughly hewn blocks of red granite and sandstone that dwarf the more refined stonework of the temple above it, the Osiris has puzzled archaeologists since its rediscovery in the early 20th century. Its architecture doesn't resemble the temple built above and around it. The central hall contains a raised platform surrounded by a water channel, evoking the same island in the primordial water symbolism associated with Osiris that we encountered at the Osiris shaft beneath Giza, reinforcing the belief that this structure was built, at least in part, as a symbolic tomb for the god himself, a place representing his death and eventual resurrection. The mainstream dating places the Osiris' construction in the same era as the temple above it, during the 19th dynasty, attributing its unusual, heavier architectural style to a deliberate choice, an intentional evocation of Egypt's ancient past, built to appear older and more primordial than it actually was, much as the 26th dynasty priests may have done at the Osiris shaft centuries later. This is a coherent explanation, grounded in Egypt's well-documented pattern of religious architecture, deliberately referencing and honoring its own deep antiquity. Not every researcher has been satisfied with that explanation, however. The Osiris' massive stonework, along with certain structural and stylistic similarities some have drawn to the Valley Temple at Giza, led a number of independent researchers across the 20th century to argue that the structure predates the 19th dynasty by a wide margin, potentially by thousands of years. This remains a fringe position, unsupported by the archaeological stratigraphy of the site, and rejected by the majority of Egyptologists who have studied it directly. But the debate has never fully gone away, in part because the Osiris genuinely does look and feel different from the temple built directly above it, a visual contrast that even mainstream scholars acknowledge without needing to invoke a different timeline to explain it. Then there is the legend that gives this chapter its name, the idea, older than modern archaeology itself, that Abydos was not merely a place representing the underworld symbolically, but a literal point of passage between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Ancient Egyptian tradition held that this was where Osiris himself was buried, or where his scattered body was ritually reassembled, depending on which version of the myth you follow. Pilgrims traveled to Abydos for millennia specifically to be near this connection, believing that proximity to this site offered them a more direct line to the afterlife than anywhere else in Egypt. Was this purely devotional symbolism, the kind of sacred geography every ancient religion constructs around its holiest sites? Almost certainly, in the view of mainstream scholarship. And yet, why here? Why did this particular stretch of desert, out of the entire length of the Nile Valley, become the fixed point the Egyptians returned to, generation after generation, for longer than most civilizations have existed at all? The Osiris still floods seasonally, its lower chambers sometimes submerged beneath groundwater, much as they may have been intentionally designed to be. Visitors today can walk along its edges and look down into the same dark water that once surrounded a platform built to represent a dying god's tomb. Was this simply an architectural echo of belief, built by people honoring a story they already knew? Or does the site's strange resistance to easy categorization, older in feeling than in verified date, sacred longer than almost anywhere else in Egypt, suggest that something about Abydos resists being fully explained by the timeline we've assigned to it? The gate, if that's what it ever was, remains standing. Whether it was ever meant to open for anyone but the god it was built for is a question Abydos has kept to itself. Not every pilgrim who traveled to a sacred site in ancient Egypt was searching for the dead. Some went searching for an answer, a cure, or a message, and they didn't expect to find it while awake. They expected to find it in sleep. Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, is best known today for the terraced mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, one of the most striking pieces of architecture to survive from ancient Egypt. But adjacent to it, cut into the same cliffs, stands a smaller and far less visited structure, the temple of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, later rededicated and expanded in association with the healer god Imhotep. By the time of the Greco-Roman period, this site had become something specific and, to modern eyes, genuinely strange, a temple where people came not to pray in the ordinary sense, but to sleep, deliberately, in hope of receiving a dream sent by the god himself. The practice is documented well enough that it isn't in serious dispute among historians. Known today as dream incubation, this ritual involved a pilgrim traveling to a temple associated with a healing deity, undergoing purification rites, and then sleeping within a designated chamber of the temple grounds, waiting for the god to visit them during the night with guidance, healing, or prophecy. Similar practices existed in the Greek world, most famously at the temples of Asclepius, but the Egyptian tradition appears to predate and likely influence these later Greek versions, particularly through the figure of Imhotep, the historical architect and physician of the Old Kingdom, who was posthumously deified and eventually equated by the Greeks with their own god of medicine. What makes this practice more than a historical curiosity is how seriously the Egyptians treated the dream itself as functional, actionable information. Papyri survive containing dream interpretation manuals, most notably the Ramesside Dream Book, dating to around the 13th century BC, which catalogs dozens of dream scenarios and their meanings, organized methodically, almost like a diagnostic reference text. Dreaming of drinking warm beer, the text tells us, was a good sign. Dreaming of one's own teeth falling out was decidedly not. This wasn't idle superstition confined to common folklore. These interpretations were compiled, preserved, and consulted with the same seriousness applied to medical or administrative texts elsewhere in Egyptian society. At the incubation temples themselves, priests were present to help interpret whatever the pilgrim experienced, translating the dream's symbolic content into practical guidance. Someone seeking a cure for illness might be told that the dream indicated a particular remedy, or that a specific ritual needed to be performed to remove whatever divine displeasure had caused their condition in the first place. In this sense, dream incubation functioned as a kind of hybrid space between religion and medicine, much like the House of Life itself, a place where spiritual and physical well-being were treated as inseparable and where sleep was not a passive state, but an active channel of communication. This much fits comfortably within a well-documented, cross-culturally common ancient practice. Where the picture becomes harder to fully explain is in the details surrounding how these dreams were actually induced, and what, if anything, was done to help ensure a pilgrim received the kind of vivid, meaningful dream the ritual required. Some temple inscriptions and associated papyri reference the use of specific incense blends, prepared specifically for use during incubation rites, though the precise recipes and their intended physiological effects remain incompletely understood. Were these purely ceremonial, meant to create the right atmosphere and mental state for a receptive pilgrim? Or did some of these preparations have genuine psychoactive properties, deliberately used to increase the likelihood of a vivid, dream-like experience during the incubation period? Mainstream Egyptology tends toward caution here, noting that without more precise botanical and chemical analysis of what little residue evidence exists, any specific claims about psychoactive substances remain speculative rather than established fact. This is precisely the space where more fringe interpretations have taken root. A number of independent researchers working outside conventional Egyptological channels have proposed that Egyptian dream incubation practices involved substances with genuinely mind-altering effects, potentially derived from plants known to have been available in the region, and that the resulting experiences may have been considerably more intense and consistent than simple sleep and ordinary dreaming would produce on its own. These claims are difficult to test conclusively given the current state of the physical evidence, and mainstream scholars generally regard them as unproven extrapolation rather than established history. But the question of exactly how consistent and vivid these dream experiences needed to be in order to sustain a religious practice across so many centuries and so many temples is a fair one to ask, and it doesn't yet have a fully satisfying answer. What we're left with is a practice that was clearly real, clearly widespread, and clearly taken seriously enough to warrant its own specialized literature and dedicated temple spaces. Pilgrims traveled real distances, underwent real rituals, and slept in these chambers with real expectations of receiving something meaningful in return. Whether what they experienced was purely psychological, chemically assisted, or something else entirely that we no longer have the means to test, is a question the temple walls at Deir el-Bahari have kept as quietly as everything else buried beneath the Theban cliffs. What exactly were people finding in their sleep? And why did an entire civilization build the architecture of medicine around the answer? A sleeping pilgrim waits for a god to visit them in a dream. But the Egyptians also believed the reverse could happen while fully awake, in the open light of a temple sanctuary, that a god could arrive not in someone's mind, but inside an object carved specifically to hold it. Walk through the inner sanctuary of almost any well-preserved Egyptian temple, Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, and eventually you reach the same architectural climax. A small, dark, enclosed chamber at the very heart of the structure, far from the open courts where ordinary worshippers were permitted. Inside stood a statue of the temple's resident deity, often modest in size compared to the monumental figures found elsewhere on the temple grounds, housed within a shrine of its own. To modern visitors, it might look like simply another artifact. To the priests who served that temple, it was something categorically different. It was, in a very real and ritually enacted sense, alive. The ceremony responsible for this transformation is well documented and goes by a name that Egyptologists translate as the opening of the mouth ritual. Originally developed and most famously associated with funerary practice, performed on mummies and tomb statues to restore the senses of the deceased in the afterlife. The same ritual framework was adapted for use on temple cult statues, animating them, in the eyes of the priesthood, with the living presence of the god they represented. The ritual involved specific tools, precise gestures, and recitations performed by a priest, touching the statue's mouth, eyes, and other sensory features in sequence, symbolically granting it the ability to see, breathe, eat, and speak. Once opened in this way, the statue was no longer treated as an inert representation. It was cared for daily, according to a formal temple schedule recorded on inscriptions and administrative papyri that survive from multiple periods of Egyptian history. Priests woke the statue each morning, cleansed it, dressed it in fresh linen, adorned it with cosmetics and jewelry, and presented it with meals, food and drink that, after a period of ritual presentation, would be removed and redistributed among the temple staff, since the god was understood to have consumed its spiritual essence while the physical substance remained. This daily cycle of care, documented extensively in temple records from sites like Karnak, is not disputed by mainstream Egyptology. It is, in fact, one of the better understood aspects of ancient Egyptian religious practice. Where the picture grows harder to fully explain is in the statue's role during public festivals, when it would be removed from its sanctuary, placed inside a portable shrine, and carried out through the temple complex on the shoulders of priests, sometimes for processions covering considerable distances between temples. Contemporary accounts describe crowds gathering to witness these processions, and in several documented cases, individuals would approach the moving shrine to ask questions of the god directly, watching for a response in the movement of the priests carrying it, a lurch forward interpreted as confirmation, a stillness or pulling back interpreted as denial. This practice, often called an oracle procession, is attested at multiple sites in multiple periods of Egyptian history, including some well into the Greco-Roman era, and represents a documented method by which ordinary Egyptians believed they could receive direct guidance from a god through the movement of its statue. Was this simply theater, choreographed by priests who controlled the shrine's movement and therefore controlled its answers? Whether consciously as a tool of religious authority or unconsciously as a kind of shared ritual performance, both priest and pilgrim accepted as legitimate. This is the explanation most mainstream historians favor, and it fits comfortably within how oracular traditions functioned in numerous ancient cultures, where human intermediaries shaped the god's apparent response without necessarily viewing this as deception, but rather as their sanctioned role within the ritual. But this explanation doesn't fully satisfy every detail found in the surviving record. Some temple inscriptions describe statues that reportedly moved, spoke, or otherwise acted in ways beyond what a shoulder-carried shrine's lurching could easily account for, including accounts, admittedly recorded by temple priesthoods with a vested interest in affirming their god's active presence, of statues appearing to sweat, weep, or shift position independently while stationary within their sanctuaries. Mainstream Egyptology generally treats these accounts as either ritual literature meant to reinforce the statue's sacred status rather than literal reportage, or as misinterpreted natural phenomena, such as condensation forming on stone or metal surfaces under specific temperature conditions within an enclosed chamber. This remains the most reasonable and evidence-supported explanation. It hasn't, however, entirely closed the question for everyone. Some researchers, working outside the conventional academic mainstream, have pointed to the sheer consistency of these accounts across different temples, different eras, and different priesthoods with no direct communication between them, asking why such a specific set of phenomena, movement, sweating, apparent independent action, would recur so uniformly across unrelated institutions if it were purely a matter of theatrical convention or environmental coincidence. There is no confirmed evidence supporting a more literal interpretation, and mainstream scholarship has not found reason to abandon its existing explanations. But the pattern itself, however it's ultimately explained, remains a documented feature of the ancient record, not an invention of modern speculation. What we know for certain is that the Egyptians built their entire religious infrastructure around the belief that a god could be made present inside an object, cared for like a living being, and consulted for answers to real questions people genuinely needed resolved. Whether that presence was purely a matter of collective belief and ritual performance, or something the priesthood understood more literally than we're comfortable crediting today, is a question that has outlived every statue, shrine, and temple built to house it. What, if anything, were they really keeping company with in the dark? A god made present inside a statue is one kind of mystery. But what happens when the god's own city, the place devoted entirely to explaining how the universe itself began, loses the very texts that recorded that explanation? That question takes us north, into Middle Egypt, to a site far less visited than Giza or Luxor, but arguably no less important to how the Egyptians understood existence itself: Hermopolis. Known to the Egyptians as Amun, and later renamed Hermopolis by the Greeks after they identified its patron god with their own Hermes, this city held a position in Egyptian religious thought that rivaled Heliopolis as a center of cosmological doctrine. Where Heliopolis credited the god Atum with the act of creation, the priesthood of Hermopolis told a different story, centered on 8 primordial deities known collectively as the Ogdoad, 4 pairs of gods and goddesses representing the raw, undifferentiated qualities of the universe before creation: darkness, formlessness, infinity, and hiddenness. According to this tradition, it was from the interaction of these 8 primordial forces, not from a single creator god acting alone, that the world eventually took shape, with Thoth himself, the city's presiding deity, credited with speaking the words that gave that formless potential its final structure. This cosmology is documented well enough that it isn't seriously disputed. Fragments referencing the Ogdoad appear in Egyptian religious texts across multiple periods, including the pyramid texts and later temple inscriptions at sites far from Hermopolis itself, suggesting this creation account carried real theological weight throughout Egyptian history. not merely local pride in one city's version of events. What's far less certain and far more difficult to reconstruct is what the priesthood at Hermopolis itself actually wrote down about this cosmology in its own dedicated library and temple archive, because almost none of it survives. Hermopolis Magna, the site itself, has not been kind to archaeologists. Centuries of continuous habitation, agricultural reuse of the land, and the systematic quarrying of ancient stone for later construction projects have left the city's temple precinct in far worse condition than better preserved sites further south. Early excavation efforts in the 19th and early 20th centuries, including work associated with Flinders Petrie, uncovered fragments, statuary, and architectural remains confirming the scale and importance of the site, but nothing resembling an intact temple library. What we know about Hermopolis's theology comes to us largely secondhand, preserved in references made at other temples, rather than from the city's own original archive. This absence matters more than it might first appear. Every other major theological center we've discussed in this exploration, Heliopolis, Memphis, Thebes, left behind enough fragmentary evidence that modern scholars have been able to reconstruct at least the outline of their core religious literature. Hermopolis, despite its clear importance and its close association with Thoth, the very god credited with inventing writing itself, has left us comparatively little in its own words. Was this simply an accident of preservation, no different from the countless other losses that have swallowed ancient texts across Egypt's long history? Or does it carry a particular irony worth sitting with, that the city devoted to the god of writing and sacred knowledge is precisely the one whose own writings failed to survive? Mainstream Egyptology generally favors the straightforward explanation. Hermopolis simply suffered worse than other sites, due to its location, its long history of continuous reuse, and the specific vulnerabilities of its building materials and archive storage compared to more isolated or better preserved temple complexes elsewhere. This is a reasonable, evidence-consistent position, and there's no need to invoke anything unusual to explain a pattern of loss that mirrors what happened to countless archives across the ancient world. And yet, the specific texts we do know were associated with Hermopolis, and its priesthood make the loss feel especially significant. Later Greco-Roman writers, drawing on Egyptian priestly sources, described Hermopolis as home to a body of sacred writings attributed to Thoth himself, tied closely to the same tradition that would eventually produce the Hermetica we discussed earlier in this series. If any physical trace of an original pre-Hellenistic Thoth textual tradition were ever going to survive somewhere in Egypt, Hermopolis, as his primary cult center, would have been the most likely place to find it. Its comparative silence, then, isn't just an ordinary archaeological gap. It's a gap in precisely the place we might have expected an answer to one of this series' earlier, still unresolved questions. This is where more speculative voices have entered the conversation, particularly outside conventional academic circles. Some researchers have proposed that the Hermopolis archive wasn't simply lost to time and reuse, but deliberately dispersed or destroyed at some point in its history, either by a priesthood seeking to protect specific knowledge from a shifting political or religious climate, or by later authorities who considered its contents incompatible with the religious order of their own era. No direct evidence supports a deliberate destruction scenario over the more mundane explanation of ordinary decay and site reuse, and most Egyptologists remain unconvinced by it. But the theory persists, in part because Hermopolis is genuinely unusual, a site of clear, sustained religious importance that has yielded remarkably little of its own primary religious literature, in a discipline where absence of evidence is common, but rarely this specific. What remains at Hermopolis today is fragmentary at best. Foundation remains, scattered statuary, echoes of a cosmology preserved mostly through other cities' references to it. Whatever the priests of Thoth once wrote down about the nature of creation, in the city built specifically to honor the god who invented writing itself, has not come down to us in its own words. Was it simply lost, the way so much has been lost across the centuries? Or did someone at some point make certain of it? Whatever was lost at Hermopolis stayed lost in silence. But 300 miles south, at Thebes, an entirely different kind of religious event unfolded in full view of the public, under the cover of night, on a scale that left one of the most extensive processional roadways in the ancient world carved directly into the landscape. And even here, in a ritual documented in exhaustive detail, questions remain about what was actually happening once the torches were extinguished and the crowds went home. The road in question still exists, at least in outline. A ceremonial avenue once lined with hundreds of sphinxes connected the Temple of Karnak to the Temple of Luxor, roughly 2 miles apart along the Nile's east bank, and served as the processional route for one of ancient Egypt's most important religious festivals, the Opet Festival, held annually and dedicated to Amun, who by the new kingdom had risen to become the preeminent state god of the Egyptian pantheon. The festival itself is exceptionally well documented, thanks largely to detailed relief carvings on the walls of Luxor Temple, commissioned under Amenhotep III and later completed under Tutankhamun, depicting the entire procession in sequence. During Opet, the cult statues of Amun, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu were removed from their sanctuaries at Karnak, placed aboard ceremonial barks, and carried, first by boat along the Nile, and in later periods by land procession along the Sphinx-lined avenue, to Luxor Temple, where they remained for a period that, depending on the era, stretched anywhere from around 11 days during the reign of Hatshepsut to as long as nearly a month by the time of Rameses III. Crowds gathered along the route. Offerings were made. Music, dancing, and public feasting accompanied the god's journey in a festival that appears to have functioned as much as a unifying civic event as a purely religious observance. This much is not mysterious in the sense of being unknown. It's some of the best documented ritual activity to survive from ancient Egypt. What draws sustained scholarly attention, and what pushes this chapter toward genuine uncertainty, is the purpose behind what happened once the god's statue arrived at Luxor and was sealed away from public view for the remainder of its stay. The relief carvings tell us the procession occurred. They are considerably less forthcoming about what took place inside the temple's inner sanctuary during the festival's most secluded phase. Mainstream Egyptological interpretation centers on the concept of royal renewal. Many scholars believe the Opet festival served, at least in part, to reaffirm and spiritually regenerate the reigning pharaoh's divine authority through a ritual reenactment of the king's divine birth and legitimacy, conducted privately within Luxor's innermost chambers, away from the public procession happening outside. This interpretation draws support from the temple's own architecture and decoration, including birth cycle reliefs found deep within Luxor Temple that explicitly connect the site to themes of divine royal conception. It's a well-supported reading, consistent with what we know about the broader Egyptian preoccupation with maintaining and periodically renewing the pharaoh's sacred legitimacy. What remains harder to pin down is how literally to interpret certain elements of the ritual language associated with this renewal, particularly phrases found in temple inscriptions describing the king's mystical union with the god during this secluded phase of the festival. Some scholars read this language as purely symbolic and liturgical, consistent with how Egyptian religious texts frequently describe the pharaoh's relationship to the divine in intensely personal, almost intimate terms, without implying any specific literal ritual act beyond standard temple offering and prayer. Others have suggested the language may point toward a more elaborate private ceremony than the surviving reliefs fully depict, one whose exact content was considered too sacred, too specific to the king's role, or too closely guarded by the priesthood to be recorded in a form accessible to anyone outside that innermost circle. Because the relevant chambers were, by design, off-limits to all but the highest-ranking priests and the king himself, we're left reconstructing a private ritual almost entirely from its public before and after. The god departs Karnak in daylight, disappears into Luxor's sealed inner chambers for days or weeks, and eventually returns. What happened during the interval is described in fragments, symbols, and formulaic religious language whose precise ritual referent remains genuinely debated rather than settled. This isn't a case of missing evidence in the way Hermopolis's lost archive represents an absence. The evidence exists, carved in stone, in extraordinary detail. It simply wasn't written to be understood by anyone standing outside the ritual itself, which may have been exactly the point. Fringe interpretations of the Opet festival have tended to focus less on invented content and more on questioning why such an important, resource-intensive ritual, one requiring weeks of preparation, an enormous procession, and the temporary relocation of the state's most important cult statues, needed to remain partially hidden at all, when so much of Egyptian religious life was, by contrast, thoroughly public and inscribed for all to see. Some have suggested this points to a genuinely two-tiered religious structure at the highest levels of Egyptian state religion, one publicly performed for the population's benefit and unity, and one privately reserved for the king and priesthood alone, whose true content may never have been intended to survive in written form under any circumstances. Whether that private content was purely symbolic theater reaffirming an already established doctrine, or something more specific and consequential that the Egyptians simply chose never to commit fully to stone, the festival itself continued for well over 1,000 years, evolving in length and elaboration, but never in its fundamental structure. Public procession, private seclusion, eventual return. What actually passed between the king and his god, behind Luxor's sealed doors, remains one of the most publicly documented private mysteries ancient Egypt ever left behind. Every ritual we've explored so far involved a king seeking to secure his power through the proper channels, sanctioned processions, guarded ceremonies, inherited titles. This next mystery concerns a man who tried to seize that power through entirely the wrong ones, and whose body, when finally examined more than 3,000 years later, still bore the unmistakable marks of exactly how that attempt ended. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo lies a mummy that for decades carried no name at all in the official record, catalogued simply as Unknown Man E. Unwrapped in 1886, the body immediately unsettled the researchers who examined it. The face is contorted in what looks unmistakably like a scream, mouth open, features twisted in what appears to be agony, frozen at the moment of death. This alone earned it a nickname that has followed it ever since, the Screaming Mummy. But it was what surrounded the body, not merely its expression, that told researchers something had gone deeply wrong with this particular burial. Unlike virtually every royal or elite mummy recovered from ancient Egypt, Unknown Man E had not been properly embalmed. There was no evidence of the careful evisceration, the packing, the resins, and lengthy preparation that defined standard Egyptian mummification practice, especially for anyone connected to the royal family. Instead, the body appeared to have been hastily wrapped, its internal organs left intact, and most strikingly, it had been enclosed in a covering made from sheepskin or goatskin, a material the Egyptians considered ritually impure, entirely inappropriate for any burial meant to help the deceased pass successfully into the afterlife. This wasn't a simple case of a modest burial for someone of lesser status. It looked, to those who studied it, like a deliberate act of religious punishment, a burial designed specifically to trap the dead rather than assist them. For decades, this striking detail remained without a confirmed identity attached to it. That changed with the help of the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a court document dating to the reign of Rameses III, roughly the 12th century BC, which records the trial proceedings following what has become known as the Harem Conspiracy, a plot to assassinate the reigning pharaoh, organized from within his own royal household. The conspiracy's central figure was Pentawere, one of Rameses III's own sons, born to a secondary wife named Tie, who apparently sought to place her son on the throne ahead of the legitimate heir by orchestrating the king's murder. The papyrus describes the plot in remarkable detail. Multiple conspirators, including harem officials, a treasurer, and individuals accused of using magical texts and wax figures to curse the king as part of the assassination attempt, blending what we might today separate into political conspiracy and ritual magic into a single, unified plan of attack. Rameses III did not survive to see the trial's conclusion, though this was long assumed to be from natural causes following the attempt. A 2012 CT scan and forensic analysis of his own mummy revealed something the papyrus itself never explicitly stated. A deep knife wound to the throat, severe enough to have been fatal almost immediately. The conspiracy, in other words, succeeded, even as the ensuing trial worked to punish everyone involved. Pentawere himself was tried and found guilty, and the historical record indicates he was offered the option to end his own life rather than face formal execution. A distinction that mattered enormously in Egyptian belief, since a state execution could carry additional ritual consequences for the condemned in the afterlife. For years, historians debated exactly which recovered mummy, if any, belonged to Pentawere. Genetic testing conducted in the early 2010s, comparing DNA from unknown man E to that of Ramesses III himself, confirmed a close paternal relationship consistent with the mummy being Pentawere, all but settling the identification that the sheepskin burial in the historical conspiracy account had already suggested. This is where the mainstream historical account is genuinely solid. A named conspirator, a documented plot, a forensically confirmed cause of the king's death, and a body whose unusual burial treatment lines up precisely with what we'd expect for a prince condemned for regicide and denied a proper royal burial as part of his punishment. Few mysteries in this series rest on as much converging physical and textual evidence as this one does. And yet the burial itself raises questions that go beyond simply confirming Pentawere's guilt. Why sheepskin specifically, rather than some other form of deliberately inferior treatment? Egyptian religious texts associated ram and goat imagery with specific negative connotations in certain funerary contexts, and some scholars have suggested the choice of this particular material was intended not merely to deny Pentawere a proper burial, but to actively curse him further, ensuring his suffering continued into whatever afterlife, if any, he was permitted to reach. If this interpretation is correct, the burial wasn't simply an absence of proper ritual. It was itself a ritual, inverted and weaponized, designed with just as much intention as any royal mummification, aimed at punishment rather than passage. The screaming expression on the mummy's face has drawn its own share of debate. Some researchers argue this is simply a natural consequence of the mummification process going wrong in the absence of proper embalming techniques, with the jaw relaxing and dropping open as the body decomposed and dried under conditions very different from a standard royal burial. This is the explanation favored by most forensic Egyptologists, and it doesn't require anything beyond ordinary biological process to account for what we see. Others, working at the more speculative edges of the discussion, have wondered whether the expression preserves something closer to an actual final moment. Whether Pentawere's death, however it occurred, involved genuine physical agony sufficient to freeze his features this way before the mummification process, however hasty, was able to begin. There's no way to fully separate history's certainty from its silence here. We know who this man was. We know what he attempted, and largely how the conspiracy against his father unfolded and ultimately succeeded despite the plot's exposure. What we don't know, and likely never will with full confidence, is precisely what happened to Pentawere in the specific hours between his sentencing and his death, or exactly how much of his final burial was designed to punish a man already gone, and how much was intended as something else entirely. A curse laid not on the past, but on whatever came after it. The sheepskin still wraps around a mummy with no coffin bearing his name. Perhaps that, too, was exactly the point. We open this exploration standing before the walls of Edfu, reading the names of Ra that the priests chose to record, and the one they didn't. It's worth returning there now because that same temple holds a second mystery, one built not into what its walls say, but into what lies beneath them. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is, by any measure, one of the best preserved temples in all of Egypt. Constructed during the Ptolemaic period between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC, its relative youth compared to sites like Karnak or Abydos is precisely why it survives in such remarkable condition. It was buried under sand and silt for centuries, protected from the erosion, looting, and repurposing that damaged older, more exposed structures. When French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette began clearing the site in the 1860s, He uncovered not just a temple, but something closer to a complete architectural and textual archive. Its walls covered in inscriptions describing temple rituals, construction records, and mythological narratives in more comprehensive detail than almost anywhere else in Egypt. Among these inscriptions is a text modern scholars refer to as the building text, a detailed account carved onto the temple's inner walls describing Edfu's own construction history and its foundation myth. According to this text, the temple's origins trace back to a far older structure, one the Ptolemaic builders claimed to be reconstructing rather than inventing outright, tied to a mythological account describing the temple as sitting atop the very location where the falcon god Horus once triumphed over his uncle Set in their legendary conflict for control of Egypt. This claim of ancient precedent is common in Egyptian temple-building tradition, and mainstream Egyptology generally treats such foundation narratives as symbolic and theological rather than literal architectural history. A newer temple laying claim to an older sacred site was a way of anchoring current religious authority in a deep and unbroken past, regardless of what specific structure, if any, had physically stood there before. What makes Edfu different from most other examples of this pattern is a specific architectural feature discovered beneath the temple's foundation during subsequent excavation and survey work. A crypt system, more extensive and more deliberately concealed than the storage crypts found in many other Egyptian temples. Edfu contains multiple such crypts, built directly into the thickness of its walls and beneath its floor level, several of which were designed with hidden access points. Concealed doorways disguised within the temple's decorated wall surfaces, detectable only by those who already knew precisely where and how to look. Some of these crypts have been fully explored, and their contents are well understood. Temple inscriptions themselves describe these spaces as storage areas for sacred temple equipment, ritual vessels, and cult objects used during festivals and ceremonies, brought out for specific occasions and returned to concealment afterward to protect them from theft and unauthorized access. This is a well-documented, thoroughly mainstream explanation, consistent with practical concerns any temple treasury would need to address, and several of Edfu's crypts, once opened by archaeologists, were found to contain reliefs depicting exactly the kinds of ritual objects the inscriptions describe. But not every chamber beneath Edfu has yielded contents that align so neatly with its inscribed purpose, and the sheer extent of the concealment built into the temple's design has prompted more sustained questions than its practical crypts alone would seem to justify. Why construct such an elaborate multi-layered system of hidden compartments, complete with disguised entry points requiring specific knowledge to locate, for objects that, according to the temple's own inscriptions, were regularly removed and used in public festivals anyway? Storage alone, some researchers have argued, doesn't fully account for the degree of architectural effort invested in keeping these spaces hidden from anyone without direct priestly knowledge of their locations. This question grows more pointed when set against the building text's own claims about Edfu's foundation resting on a far older sacred site. If the Ptolemaic builders genuinely believed, or wanted others to believe, that their temple stood atop a location of profound and ancient religious significance, is it plausible that the crypt system served, at least in part, to protect or reference something connected to that older claim, rather than purely functioning as festival storage for the temple's current use? Mainstream Egyptology remains cautious here, noting there is no confirmed physical evidence of any structure predating the Ptolemaic temple beneath Edfu's current foundations, and that the crypt's contents, where excavated, have consistently matched their inscribed mundane purpose. The foundation myth, in this reading, remains theological rather than a literal architectural record. Still, not every chamber beneath Edfu has been definitively opened, mapped, and published in a way that has fully satisfied independent researchers working outside conventional academic frameworks. Some have pointed to inconsistencies between the temple's known ground plan and irregularities noted in early survey reports, suggesting the full extent of Edfu's substructure may not yet be completely understood, even after more than a century of study. Others, extending this uncertainty further into far more speculative territory, have proposed that Edfu's foundation myth encodes a memory, however distorted through millennia of retelling, of genuinely ancient religious activity at this specific site, predating not just the Ptolemaic temple, but potentially extending back to a period of Egyptian prehistory for which we have little to no direct archaeological evidence at all. This remains entirely unproven, well outside what the current evidence supports. And it is not a position held by mainstream Egyptology. But it persists in certain circles precisely because Edfu itself, more than almost any other Egyptian temple, was built by people who wanted you to know their sacred ground had a story stretching back further than their own construction records could verify. What survives today at Edfu is a temple almost uniquely intact among its peers, offering scholars an extraordinary window into Ptolemaic-era religious practice, temple administration, and mythological tradition. Its crypts, for the most part, tell a straightforward story of sacred objects carefully guarded between festivals. But the sheer scale of concealment built into this particular temple, paired with a foundation myth insisting on a sacred history far older than the stones we can actually date, leaves a narrower, more persistent question standing quietly beneath all that well-documented ritual furniture. If the Ptolemaic priests who built Edfu believed they were reconstructing something ancient rather than inventing it outright, what exactly did they believe they were protecting? And is there any chamber beneath that temple floor that still hasn't given up its reason for being hidden at all? Some questions in this series have concerned buried chambers, missing scrolls, or objects that no longer exist. This one concerns something harder to pin down entirely. Not an object, but a presence, reported again and again over more than a century, by people with no obvious reason to invent it. Karnak is the largest religious complex ever built by human hands, expanded continuously for roughly 2,000 years by successive generations of pharaohs, until it sprawled across more than 200 acres on the east bank of the Nile at Thebes. Its hypostyle hall alone contains 134 massive columns, several rising over 70 feet, arranged in rows so dense that walking among them in low light produces an effect modern visitors still describe as overwhelming, almost disorienting. A forest of carved stone that seems to swallow sound and direction alike. At its height, Karnak wasn't simply a temple. It was effectively a small city, housing thousands of priests, administrators, and workers dedicated to serving Amun and maintaining the daily rituals we discussed earlier in this series, including the elaborate processions of the Yaphet festival that once began within its walls. Given the scale of religious activity that took place here across 2 millennia, it's perhaps unsurprising that Karnak has accumulated more than its share of reported unexplained experiences among the archaeologists, guards, and visitors who have spent time within its walls, particularly after dark or in the complex's more isolated corners. What is more surprising, and considerably harder to dismiss outright, is how consistent these reports have remained across more than a century. From multiple unrelated witnesses working in different eras, under different conditions, often with no knowledge of each other's accounts. The most frequently repeated reports describe the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, and distinctly ritualistic in cadence, heard by site guards and researchers working late in specific sections of the temple complex, particularly near the hypostyle hall and the sacred lake used historically for priestly purification rites. Several early 20th century excavators, working during a period when large sections of Karnak were still being cleared of sand and debris accumulated over centuries, noted in personal accounts and letters a persistent sense of being watched or accompanied while working alone in certain areas after sunset. Sensations several of them explicitly attributed to what they described, only half-jokingly in most cases, as the lingering presence of the temple's ancient priesthood. None of this constitutes evidence in any scientific sense, and mainstream Egyptology, understandably, treats these accounts as anecdotal rather than historical. The straightforward explanation accounts for a great deal here. Karnak's acoustic properties are genuinely unusual, a product of its massive stone columns and long, echoing corridors, capable of carrying and distorting sound across considerable distances in ways that could easily transform ordinary noise, wind, distant human activity, settling stone, into something that sounds, to an isolated listener already primed by the temple's history and atmosphere, like organized chanting. Psychological factors deserve equal weight in any honest accounting. Working alone at night inside a 2,000-year-old religious complex built specifically to inspire awe and a sense of divine presence is, by design, an environment likely to produce exactly the kind of subjective experience these witnesses describe, without requiring anything beyond ordinary human perception under unusual circumstances. This explanation, while reasonable, doesn't fully account for every detail embedded in the historical pattern of these reports. Why do the reported experiences cluster so consistently around specific locations within Karnak's vast footprint, the hypostyle hall and the sacred lake in particular, rather than distributing more randomly across the complex's considerable size? Both locations carry genuine ritual significance. The hypostyle hall served as a primary processional space during major festivals, while the sacred lake was central to priestly purification rites performed before entering the temple's most sacred inner chambers. If these reports are purely a matter of acoustics and suggestion, why would they align so closely with the specific spaces that carried the deepest ritual weight within the complex, rather than areas of comparable architectural scale but lesser religious function? Egyptologists who have addressed this pattern directly tend to point toward a reasonable, if slightly circular, explanation. These are simply the areas most commonly frequented by researchers and guards during the hours when such experiences are most likely to be reported, meaning any correlation with ritual significance may say more about human traffic patterns than about anything intrinsic to the locations themselves. This is a fair point, and it likely accounts for a meaningful portion of the pattern. Whether it accounts for all of it is a separate question, one that hasn't been definitively settled by any systematic study, largely because the subject matter itself resists the kind of controlled, repeatable investigation available to more conventional archaeological questions. Beyond the acoustic and psychological explanations favored by mainstream researchers, a smaller number of independent investigators have proposed a more speculative interpretation, suggesting that sites subjected to such intensive, sustained ritual activity over such an extended period of time might retain some form of residual imprint, detectable under specific conditions by particularly sensitive individuals. This idea, sometimes referred to broadly as stone tape theory in paranormal research circles, has no accepted scientific basis and is not endorsed by mainstream archaeology or physics. It remains, at best, an unfalsifiable hypothesis rather than a testable claim. But it persists in the conversation around Karnak specifically because the site's reported phenomena have shown a degree of consistency across time and witness that many comparable claims at other locations simply don't demonstrate. What we're left with ultimately is a temple built and rebuilt across 2,000 years by a civilization that believed, quite literally, in the ongoing presence of the divine within its walls, cared for daily by priests who treated their gods as living residents rather than distant abstractions. Whether something of that belief, or the sheer accumulated weight of 2 millennia of continuous ritual practice, has left any trace beyond the stone itself, is not a question archaeology is currently equipped to answer definitively, one way or the other. The chanting, if that's what it is, has been reported by soldiers, scholars, and site guards who had every professional reason not to take the claim seriously, and reported it anyway. Karnak's columns still stand exactly where they were placed. Whether anything else still moves among them, particularly once the last visitors have gone and the gates have closed for the night, remains a question the temple has never definitively answered either way. Karnak's chanting, if it exists at all, has never been captured, measured, or verified by any instrument brought into the temple to listen for it. But elsewhere in Egypt, a very different kind of statue-born sound was documented so consistently, by so many independent witnesses across so many centuries, that ancient authors treated it not as rumor, but as established fact, recorded, discussed, and eventually silenced by history in a way we can actually trace. On the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, 2 colossal seated statues rise nearly 60 feet into the air, weathered and cracked, facing east toward the rising sun across what was once fertile farmland. These are the Colossi of Memnon, and despite the name later attached to them by Greek visitors, they were never meant to represent the legendary Memnon of Homeric myth at all. They depict Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, and originally stood as guardians before the entrance to his mortuary temple, a structure that was, at the time of its construction in the 14th century BC, likely the largest religious complex ever built in Egypt, larger, by some estimates, than Karnak itself. That temple is almost entirely gone now, its stone dismantled and repurposed by later pharaohs for their own building projects, leaving the two colossi standing essentially alone in what is now open field, isolated survivors of a structure that once surrounded them completely. And it was in this state, weathered, cracked, and separated from the temple they once guarded, that the statues began producing a sound that would draw travelers from across the ancient Mediterranean world specifically to hear it. Beginning sometime after an earthquake damaged the northern Colossus around 27 BC, ancient writers began reporting that the statue produced an audible sound each morning around sunrise, typically described as a musical note, a whistle, or a low, resonant tone. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the decades following the earthquake, recorded hearing the sound himself during a visit to the site, describing it as resembling a slight blow or strike. Pliny the Elder referenced it as well in his own writings. By the 2nd century AD, the site had become enough of a destination that visitors left behind more than 90 inscriptions carved directly into the statue's base, recording their names, the date of their visit, and in many cases, explicit confirmation that they had personally heard the sound, a remarkably direct form of ancient eyewitness testimony, preserved in stone by the very people who experienced it. This is not disputed history in any meaningful sense. The inscriptions exist. The ancient accounts exist. Multiple independent visitors, writing in different decades and with no coordination between them, described experiencing the same specific phenomenon at the same specific statue. Something was genuinely happening at the Colossi of Memnon for roughly 2 centuries following that earthquake, consistently enough and publicly enough that it became a recognized attraction within the Roman world, drawing visitors specifically for the experience of hearing it. The most widely accepted modern explanation involves simple physics. The earthquake's damage likely created cracks within the statue's stone, and as morning temperatures rose after a cool desert night, the resulting thermal expansion, combined with evaporating dew trapped within those cracks, may have produced an audible resonant sound as trapped air and moisture escaped through the fractured stone. This phenomenon isn't unique to Memnon. Similar acoustic effects from thermally stressed rock have been documented elsewhere, and it offers a physically plausible mechanism requiring no explanation beyond ordinary material science, responding to Egypt's specific desert climate and the statue's particular damage pattern. What complicates this otherwise satisfying explanation is what happened next. Around 199 AD, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, during a visit to the site, ordered repairs made to the damaged Colossus, apparently attempting to restore it rather than leave it in its evocative cracked state. Following those repairs, the sound stopped entirely, and no verified account describes hearing it again. This detail is consistent with the thermal crack explanation. Repairing the fractures would logically eliminate the mechanism producing the sound, but it also means we lost any opportunity for closer, more rigorous ancient investigation into a phenomenon that, until that point, had been reliably reproducible for nearly 2 centuries. Modern science arrived roughly 1,700 years too late to study the sound directly, and must instead work entirely from historical description and comparable acoustic phenomena observed elsewhere. This gap between mechanism and motive is where the more speculative interpretations of Memnon's voice have taken root, both in antiquity and in modern alternative research. Ancient visitors themselves rarely treated the sound as merely an interesting acoustic accident. Many explicitly framed it in oracular terms, treating the statue's voice as a form of divine communication, sometimes asking questions and interpreting the sound's presence or absence, or its perceived tone and timing, as a favorable or unfavorable sign. This interpretation fits within the broader ancient Mediterranean practice of oracular consultation we've touched on earlier in this series, extended here to a monument the Greeks and Romans had already renamed after a mythological figure associated with dawn and divine favor. Whether the Egyptians themselves, prior to Roman-era visitors, had already attributed similar significance to the statue before the earthquake that seems to have triggered the sound remains genuinely unclear, since the phenomenon itself only appears in the historical record after that seismic event damaged the original 18th dynasty monument. A smaller number of modern researchers, working outside mainstream archaeology and acoustics, have questioned whether thermal cracking alone fully accounts for a sound reported as being loud, distinct, and reliably audible enough to draw dedicated travelers and prompt formal government repair, rather than the more subtle, inconsistent acoustic emissions typically associated with thermally stressed stone elsewhere. This remains a minority position without a fully developed alternative mechanism to replace the conventional explanation, and most experts studying the phenomenon consider the thermal crack theory sufficient given the available evidence. But the sheer specificity and duration of the ancient reports, nearly 2 centuries of consistent testimony, ended precisely at the moment repairs were made, leaves a narrow space for the question to remain formally open rather than fully closed. The colossi of Memnon still sit in their open field today, silent, their cracks long since sealed by Roman-era repair work that outlived the empire that ordered it. Thousands of tourists visit each year, and none of them hear anything beyond the wind and the sound of their own footsteps on ancient stone. Whether that silence represents the simple end of an explainable physical process, or the closing of something the Romans themselves treated as far more significant than broken rock, is a question the statues have kept exactly as still as everything else about them for the better part of 2,000 years. A statue that spoke, then fell silent when repaired. A temple that may still hum with the memory of ritual, or may simply carry sound the way old stone always has. Both mysteries share a common thread we haven't yet pulled on directly: the belief that a pharaoh, even in death, remained genuinely protected, not merely by locked doors and hidden passages, but by something meant to act against intruders long after the last living guard had gone home. The Egyptians called them curses, though that word, borrowed largely from 20th century journalism, doesn't quite capture what the tomb inscriptions themselves describe. Scattered across mastaba tombs, pyramid entrances, and burial chambers spanning the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom, a specific category of inscribed warning appears with enough regularity that Egyptologists have studied it as its own distinct genre of funerary text. These threats promise specific consequences for anyone who violates the tomb, defiles the burial, or disturbs the deceased's eternal rest. Consequences that range from the relatively mundane, such as a promise that the violator's own descendants will suffer misfortune, to language invoking divine retribution directly, calling on gods like Thoth or Sekhmet to punish the offender's body and spirit both. One of the more frequently cited examples comes from the tomb of Antiphai, a provincial governor from the First Intermediate Period, whose inscription warns that any man who damages the tomb will be judged and condemned before the great god himself. Similar language appears at numerous other sites across Egyptian history, consistently enough that mainstream Egyptology treats these inscriptions as a well-understood and expected feature of elite Egyptian burial practice, functioning much like the deterrent warnings found on tombs and legal boundary markers across many other ancient cultures. Fear of divine punishment in a civilization as thoroughly religious as ancient Egypt was a genuinely powerful psychological deterrent, and inscribing that fear directly into the tomb's entrance cost the builders nothing beyond the labor of carving it. This straightforward explanation accounts for the vast majority of these inscriptions comfortably. Where the subject becomes more difficult to fully close is in the specific, well-documented cluster of unusual deaths and misfortunes that followed the 1922 discovery and excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter's expedition. Events that gave rise to the modern popular notion of the mummy's curse in the first place, and that continue to generate genuine scholarly discussion despite decades of skeptical analysis. The basic timeline is not in dispute. Lord Carnarvon, The expedition's primary financial backer died in April 1923, just months after the tomb's opening, from an infected mosquito bite that developed into blood poisoning and ultimately pneumonia. Reports at the time and in the decades since have noted a range of additional deaths and illnesses among individuals connected to the excavation or its associated visitors, compiled into lists of varying length and reliability depending on the source. Some clearly exaggerated by contemporary press eager for a sensational story, others involving genuine, verifiable deaths that occurred within a time frame that at least invites the question of coincidence versus pattern. Mainstream scholarship has addressed this directly and, for the most part, persuasively. Statistical analyses conducted by researchers examining mortality rates among those present at the tomb's opening found no significant deviation from expected lifespans for people of similar age and health in that era, once the full excavation team and associated individuals were considered rather than a selectively curated list of the most dramatic cases. Separately, a more specific and scientifically grounded hypothesis has gained traction regarding tombs generally: the potential presence of harmful pathogens, particularly certain molds and bacteria capable of surviving in sealed, undisturbed burial environments for millennia, which could plausibly cause respiratory illness in those who first disturb a long-sealed chamber's air. Aspergillus, a mold genus known to cause serious lung infections in individuals with compromised immune systems, has been specifically identified in some Egyptian tomb environments during later scientific study, offering a genuinely plausible biological mechanism that could account for at least some historical illnesses attributed to a curse without requiring anything beyond ordinary, if unpleasant, microbiology. This explanation carries real scientific weight, and most Egyptologists and historians regard it, combined with simple statistical coincidence and the exaggerating effects of sensational contemporary journalism, as sufficient to account for the Tutankhamun-related deaths without needing to invoke anything beyond natural, explainable causes. It is worth noting directly that Howard Carter himself, the person with by far the most sustained and direct physical exposure to the tomb's interior throughout the excavation, lived until 1939, dying at the age of 64 from lymphoma, a detail frequently cited by skeptics as difficult to reconcile with any genuine curse mechanism that supposedly targeted those who disturbed the burial most directly. And yet the broader question behind these individual explanations remains only partially answered, because it was never really about whether any single curse mechanism is real. It's about why the Egyptians themselves so consistently believed something needed to guard their dead beyond stone doors and hidden passages in the first place, and whether that belief, however unverifiable its specific mechanism, reflects a genuine, culturally embedded understanding of tomb environments as dangerous in ways the Egyptians couldn't fully articulate in modern scientific terms, but had nonetheless observed and responded to across centuries of practical burial experience. Did generations of priests and tomb builders notice empirically that certain sealed spaces produced illness in those who entered them, and encode that observed danger into religious and magical language, because that was the explanatory framework available to them, long before germ theory gave later civilizations a different vocabulary for the same underlying threat? This is where more speculative interpretations extend furthest beyond what current evidence directly supports. Some researchers working outside mainstream Egyptology have proposed that certain tomb warning inscriptions may reference genuinely deliberate defensive measures beyond curse language alone, citing unverified and largely anecdotal reports, mostly undocumented in rigorous archaeological literature, of unusual residues or substances found near some tomb entrances that could theoretically have been intended to cause harm to intruders. No confirmed, peer-reviewed evidence currently supports the existence of deliberately engineered toxic traps in Egyptian tombs, and this remains a minority position without strong archaeological backing. But it persists in certain circles precisely because the biological hazard theory, however well supported for cases like tomb-borne mold exposure, doesn't fully explain every historical account of misfortune associated with disturbed burials across multiple different sites and eras. What we're left with, in the end, is a civilization that inscribed protection into its tombs with the same seriousness it inscribed everything else meant to last into eternity. and a modern record of illness and misfortune following certain excavations that science has largely, though perhaps not entirely, been able to account for through ordinary explanation. The guardians the Egyptians described were never meant to be seen. Whether they were purely words carved to frighten the living, or something closer to an ancient, imperfect record of a genuine danger lying dormant in sealed stone, is a question every sealed tomb still unopened beneath Egypt's sand has not yet been asked to answer. Every guardian we've discussed so far was invoked to protect the dead from the living. What happened at Amarna reverses that entirely. Here it was the living who tried to erase the dead, and an entire priesthood that paid the price for a war they didn't start. The ruins of Akhenaten, the city we now call Amarna, sit on a remote stretch of the Nile's east bank, roughly midway between Cairo and Luxor, chosen deliberately by Akhenaten for its isolation, its virgin land untouched by any previous city or temple. Founded around 1346 BC, this was to be the capital of an entirely new religious order, one that abandoned Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of exclusive devotion to the Aten, the visible sun disk itself, elevated by Akhenaten to a position of singular, unprecedented importance in Egyptian religious history. For roughly 17 years, this city functioned as the center of Egyptian political and religious life, home to a reorganized priesthood devoted entirely to the new cult, operating in direct competition with, and ultimately in place of, the enormously powerful priesthood of Amun we discussed earlier in this series, whose wealth and influence at Karnak had grown to rival the pharaoh's own authority in the generations before Akhenaten's reign. This much is settled history, supported by extensive archaeological work at the site itself, including boundary stelae erected around the city that explicitly describe Akhenaten's religious intentions in his own recorded words. What happened after Akhenaten's death, however, moved from religious reform into something closer to deliberate historical erasure, and it's here that the mystery genuinely begins. Within a generation of Akhenaten's death, Akhenaten was abandoned entirely. The traditional priesthood of Amun, restored to power under Akhenaten's eventual successors, oversaw a systematic campaign to remove him from Egyptian memory. His name was chiseled off monuments across the country. His statues were destroyed or repurposed as building material for other structures. Later official king lists, including the Abydos king list we discussed earlier in this exploration, simply skip over his reign entirely, along with those of his immediate successors, as though the entire episode had never occurred. For the traditional priesthood, this wasn't merely political consolidation. It was framed and executed as a religious necessity, a restoration of cosmic order following what they regarded as a dangerous and illegitimate deviation from the proper worship of the gods. The fate of Akhenaten's own priesthood, the men and women who had staffed the temples of the Aten at Amarna, who had built their careers and their spiritual identities entirely around a religious order that lasted less than 2 decades before being violently reversed, is where the historical record grows genuinely thin. Unlike Akhenaten himself, whose downfall is at least documented, however selectively, through the very act of erasing him, his priesthood largely vanishes from the record without any comparable trace of what became of them individually. Did they face formal punishment under the restored traditional order? Were they absorbed back into conventional temple structures, their previous allegiance quietly overlooked in exchange for compliance? Did some simply disappear from the historical and archaeological record entirely, their names never recorded again in any official capacity? The honest answer, according to mainstream Egyptology, is that we simply don't have enough surviving documentation to say with confidence, and this gap itself is part of what makes this specific chapter of Egyptian history so difficult to fully close. This uncertainty becomes more pointed against the backdrop of what we know happened to Akhenaten's immediate family and closest associates in the years following his death, a period marked by a rapid, almost frantic succession of short-reigned rulers, culminating in the death of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun himself at around 18 or 19 years old, under circumstances that remain debated among specialists, ranging from illness and genetic complications linked to his parents' close familial relationship, to more contested theories involving injury or violence. Add to this the still unexplained damage found on the mummy of Ramesses III's assassinated body discussed earlier, and the broader pattern across this period of Egyptian history. Rapid successions, unexplained deaths, deliberate erasures, creates an atmosphere that later popular writers have found impossible to resist framing in terms of a genuine curse, one specifically tied to the religious upheaval Akhenaten set in motion and the fury it apparently provoked among the priesthood he displaced. Mainstream historians are, understandably, cautious about this framing. The instability following Akhenaten's reign is more parsimoniously explained by ordinary political and dynastic turmoil, a religious reform that alienated Egypt's most powerful existing institution, a line of succession weakened by the deaths of several potential heirs, and the kind of court intrigue that similarly destabilized numerous ancient monarchies with no need to invoke divine retribution at all. Tutankhamun's health problems are reasonably well documented through modern genetic and skeletal analysis, pointing toward plausible medical explanations rooted in his family's documented practice of close-kin marriage rather than any supernatural cause. Still, the sheer completeness of Akhenaten's priesthood's disappearance from the record, when set beside the far more visible and violent erasure of Akhenaten himself, leaves room for a narrower, more specific question that mainstream scholarship hasn't fully resolved. Was this priesthood's vanishing simply a natural consequence of an institution losing its royal patronage and dissolving quietly into obscurity? Or did the restoration of the traditional order involve a more deliberate, more thorough suppression of these individuals specifically, one severe enough that almost nothing of their fate was permitted to survive in any form? Some independent researchers, working outside conventional academic frameworks, have speculated that the traditional priesthood's response to Akhenaten's religious revolution extended into deliberate ritual retaliation against his former priests, framed in terms the Amun priesthood itself would have understood as restoring cosmic balance rather than committing straightforward political violence. There is no confirmed archaeological or textual evidence directly supporting this specific claim, and it remains speculative rather than established. What survives at Amarna today is a city stripped almost bare, its stone dismantled and hauled away for later construction projects, its temples reduced largely to foundation outlines in the desert sand. The priesthood that once served there left behind titles, occasional names and scattered inscriptions, and then, for the most part, silence. Whether that silence represents nothing more than the ordinary fading of a defeated institution, or the deliberate thorough work of a priesthood determined to ensure its rivals left no trace at all, is a question Amarna's empty foundations have never been rebuilt enough to answer. Amarna's priesthood vanished because a rival theology returned to power and made certain it stayed buried. But there's an older, stranger case of the Egyptian priesthood's legacy going quiet, not through violent erasure, but through something closer to willful forgetting, tied to a belief so old that even the Egyptians of the New Kingdom treated it as ancient history rather than living memory. We spoke earlier in this series about Hermopolis and its patron priesthood devoted to the Ogdoad, the 8 primordial deities said to have existed before creation itself took shape. What we didn't discuss is that Hermopolis wasn't the only site associated with this theology, and it may not even have been the original one. Egyptian tradition preserved a persistent belief that the Ogdoad, having completed their role in creation, didn't simply cease to exist. According to several surviving religious texts, they died, a genuinely unusual concept within Egyptian theology, where most deities were understood as eternal by definition, and were buried at a specific sacred location associated with the town of Jemme, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, in what is now the site of Medinet Habu. This claim is preserved primarily through inscriptions found at Medinet Habu itself, particularly those associated with a small, comparatively modest temple structure on the site, whose original construction likely dates to the early 18th dynasty, making it considerably older than the massive mortuary temple of Ramesses III. That would later be built directly beside it and would come to dominate the site visually for anyone visiting today. This smaller temple, referred to in some inscriptions using language that scholars translate as relating to the primeval god's burial place, appears to have functioned as a specific cultic center dedicated to honoring the Ogdoad not as living, active deities receiving daily offerings in the manner we discussed with the temple statues at Karnak, but specifically as ancestral, deceased forces whose burial site required its own particular form of veneration. This detail alone sets Medinet Habu's original temple apart from virtually every other Egyptian religious structure we've examined in this series. Egyptian religion, as reflected in temple after temple across the country, was overwhelmingly organized around the ongoing, active presence of its gods, cared for daily, consulted through oracles, carried in procession, housed in animated statues believed to see, breathe, and speak. A temple built specifically to honor gods understood to be dead, buried, and no longer active in the same way, is a genuine theological outlier, and it raises a question mainstream Egyptology has engaged with directly, but not fully resolved. What did the Egyptians believe actually happened to divine power once a god was understood to have died in this specific sense? Did the Ogdoad's death represent a complete cessation of their influence? Or did it transform into something more diffuse, embedded permanently into the fabric of creation they were credited with originating, no longer requiring the kind of daily personal maintenance other gods received precisely because their work and their presence had already been folded irreversibly into the world itself? Most Egyptologists studying this question lean toward the latter interpretation, consistent with the broader Egyptian tendency to understand cosmology in layered cyclical terms rather than strict linear endings. The Ogdoad's death in this reading wasn't an erasure, but a completion, freeing them from the ongoing cultic demands placed on more actively worshipped deities while still preserving their foundational importance to Egyptian religious thought. This explanation fits comfortably within what we know of Egyptian theological flexibility more broadly, and it's the position most consistent with the available inscriptional evidence. What remains harder to fully account for is the specific ritual activity that appears to have taken place at this Medinet Habu temple on a periodic, rather than daily, basis. Inscriptions and later temple records suggest that offerings and ceremonies here followed an unusual schedule tied to specific festival periods, rather than the constant daily maintenance cycle typical of active cult statues elsewhere. Some records indicate offerings were made here as infrequently as once every 10 days during certain periods, a substantially different rhythm from what we'd expect for a living, actively worshipped deity, and one that reinforces the site's unusual status, but doesn't fully clarify what specific ritual purpose these periodic ceremonies were actually intended to achieve, or what the priests performing them believed they were accomplishing during each visit to a god already understood to be gone. This is where the more speculative threads of interpretation have found their footing. A handful of independent researchers have proposed that Medinet Habu's original temple may have served, at least in part, as a kind of ritual containment site, less a place of simple honor for departed gods, and more a location specifically maintained to ensure that whatever primordial pre-creation forces the Ogdoad represented remained properly settled and inactive, rather than risking a return to the formless chaos that existed before their work began. There is no direct textual confirmation of this specific framing in the surviving inscriptions, and mainstream Egyptology generally reads the site's periodic offerings as ordinary ancestral veneration rather than active containment ritual. But the underlying theological tension the theory points toward is a real one, a civilization deeply preoccupied with maintaining cosmic order, honoring, at a site built specifically for the purpose, the very forces of formlessness and darkness that order was originally created to hold back. Today, the smaller Ogdoad temple at Medinet Habu survives largely in the shadow of Ramesses III's far more visually dominant mortuary complex beside it, visited by a fraction of the tourists who pass directly by it on their way to the larger structure's more famous reliefs. Its inscriptions remain only partially studied compared to Egypt's more heavily excavated theological centers, and its specific ritual calendar has never been fully reconstructed. Whether this modest temple represents simple ancestral piety toward the gods who began the world, or something closer to an ongoing, quietly maintained watch over forces the Egyptians never fully trusted to stay settled, is a question the site has kept as unassuming as its own understated architecture, easy to walk past and easier still to underestimate. We mentioned several chapters ago that a statue in an Egyptian temple was never simply an object. that a specific ceremony transformed it into something the priesthood treated as genuinely alive. We didn't linger on that ceremony itself. It deserves its own chapter, because the ritual in question, known as the opening of the mouth, may be the single most consequential and least fully understood act of ritual technology the ancient Egyptians ever developed. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in collections around the world, a peculiar object appears again and again in tomb assemblages. A small curved blade, often made from meteoric iron in its earliest known forms, shaped somewhat like an adze, the woodworking tool used for shaping timber. This object, known as the paseshkef in some contexts and closely related to other ritual adzes used in later periods, wasn't a practical tool at all, despite its resemblance to one. It was the primary instrument of the opening of the mouth ceremony, and its specific shape, modeled after an actual carpentry tool, wasn't incidental. It reflected a genuine belief that the ritual it performed was itself a form of craftsmanship, quite literally finishing the construction of a body, whether that body was a carved statue, a wrapped mummy, or even a temple relief, so that it could function as a living vessel for consciousness rather than simply an object shaped to resemble one. The ritual's origins reach back further than almost any other religious practice we've discussed in this series, with textual and pictorial evidence confirming its use as early as the Old Kingdom, and quite possibly earlier still. Tomb reliefs from this period depict the ceremony being performed on statues of the deceased, showing priests approaching the statue with specific ritual implements, touching them to the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose in careful sequence, while reciting formulas meant to activate each sense in turn. By the time of the New Kingdom, the ritual had been extensively documented in written form, most comprehensively in a text scholars refer to simply as the opening of the mouth papyrus tradition, which describes the ceremony unfolding across as many as 75 distinct ritual episodes, though not every performance of the rite necessarily included the full sequence. The core theological logic behind the ritual is well understood and not seriously disputed. Egyptian belief held that a statue, a mummy, or a relief image, however skillfully crafted, remained inert, a body without the capacity to function as a vessel for the deceased's spirit, or, in a temple context, for a god's living presence, until specific ritual action granted it functioning senses. The ceremony's name refers to its most emphasized action, opening the mouth specifically, because breath and speech were considered fundamental to genuine active existence in Egyptian thought. A being that could not breathe or speak could not truly be said to live, regardless of how perfectly its physical form had been rendered. But the ritual extended well beyond the mouth alone, addressing the eyes so the recipient could see, the ears so it could hear, and even, in some versions, the hands, so that the deceased or the divine image could reach out and receive offerings directly. This much sits comfortably within established Egyptological understanding, supported by an unusually rich body of textual, pictorial, and material evidence spanning close to 3,000 years of continuous use. Where the ceremony grows considerably harder to fully reconstruct is in the specifics of its actual performance. Not the theology behind it, which the text described clearly, but the precise physical and sensory experience the ritual was meant to produce, and how literally the priesthood understood the transformation they believed themselves to be enacting. Consider the tools themselves. Beyond the paseshkef blade, the full ceremony called for an extensive kit of ritual implements, many of which are depicted in tomb and temple reliefs, but whose exact function remains only partially reconstructed from context, since the accompanying texts often describe the ritual actions and their theological significance without providing the kind of step-by-step practical instruction a modern reader might expect. Some implements were clearly symbolic, representing specific mythological episodes tied to the ritual's origin story, which credited its first performance to the god Horus, acting to restore his father Osiris to functioning life following his murder by Set. Other tools, however, including specific chisel-like implements and small vessels used for particular stages of the ceremony, have generated genuine scholarly disagreement about their precise sequence of use and exact symbolic purpose, since surviving depictions sometimes vary in the order and combination of implements shown from one tomb or temple to another. This variation itself raises a question worth sitting with. Was the opening of the mouth ceremony performed with meaningful regional or period-specific differences across Egypt's long history, adapted by different priesthoods according to local tradition, the way many Egyptian rituals evolved over time? Or do these apparent inconsistencies instead reflect something closer to selective recording, where different tomb owners or temple builders chose to depict only the specific portions of a longer, more standardized ceremony that held particular personal or theological significance to them, without necessarily indicating any real variation in how the full ritual was actually performed? Mainstream Egyptology generally favors a combination of both explanations, acknowledging genuine regional and temporal variation, while also recognizing that our evidence is inherently partial, drawn from what individual patrons chose to have carved rather than a single complete master text describing the ceremony in its entirety from any one period. A more specific and genuinely unresolved question concerns how the priesthood understood the ritual's actual effectiveness, separate from its theological framing. Did Egyptian priests performing this ceremony believe in some functional sense that they were producing a real, detectable transformation in the object or body before them, one that they themselves might expect to perceive in some way, however subtle? Or did they understand the ritual primarily as a necessary formal act, whose efficacy was accepted on theological authority rather than expected to manifest in any observable change to the object itself? This distinction matters enormously for how we interpret an entire category of Egyptian religious practice, and the honest answer is that the surviving texts don't fully settle it either way. The ritual language itself is often written in remarkably direct, almost literal terms, describing the recipient's eyes as now able to see, its ears as now able to hear, without the kind of explicit theological commentary that might clarify whether this language was understood as poetic ritual formula or as a description of a genuinely expected functional change. It's within this specific ambiguity that more speculative interpretations have found room to operate, particularly around the ceremony's most consistently emphasized tool, the meteoric iron blade used in its earliest and most consequential form. Iron was an exceptionally rare and difficult material to work with in early Egypt, arriving almost exclusively through meteoric sources long before Egypt developed reliable terrestrial ironworking, and its use specifically for this ritual, rather than the far more common and available materials used elsewhere in Egyptian craft and religious practice, has prompted sustained scholarly interest in its own right. Mainstream interpretation generally connects this material choice to the metal's celestial origin, fitting naturally into a ceremony concerned with granting divine, sky-derived life force to an earthly object. A symbolically coherent explanation requiring nothing beyond the Egyptians' well-documented reverence for materials associated with the heavens. A smaller number of researchers, working at the edges of conventional Egyptology, have questioned whether the specific insistence on this particular material, maintained across such an enormous span of Egyptian history, despite the significant practical difficulty of consistently sourcing it, might reflect something more than symbolic preference alone. Whether the Egyptians associated some specific property with meteoric iron, distinct from ordinary metal, that they considered functionally necessary to the ritual's success, rather than merely appropriate to its theme. There is no confirmed evidence supporting this stronger claim, and the symbolic explanation remains both simpler and better supported by the available textual record. But the sheer persistence of the material choice, sustained long after Egypt had ready access to other metals that could have served an equivalent symbolic purpose with far less logistical difficulty, leaves the question open enough that it continues to surface in specialist discussion, even among scholars who ultimately favor the conventional reading. What we're left with, in the end, is a ceremony performed with remarkable consistency across nearly the entire span of ancient Egyptian civilization, applied to statues, mummies, temple reliefs, and cult images alike, all resting on a shared belief that a properly crafted form required one final act to become something more than the sum of its carved or wrapped materials. We understand this ritual's theology with real confidence. We understand considerably less about how its practitioners experienced its performance, what they expected to happen in the moment the mouth was touched and the formula spoken, and whether any of them, across 3,000 years of repeating this exact ceremony, ever believed they had witnessed something the rest of us would recognize as a genuine, observable change take place before their eyes. The blade still exists in museum cases today, its edge long dulled, its ritual purpose fully catalogued and explained. Whether anything it once opened ever truly looked back is a question the ceremony's own language never quite answers either way. The opening of the mouth ceremony marked the final act performed on a body before it could be considered complete. But everything that made that final act possible, the body itself, preserved, wrapped, and prepared to receive it, was the work of a separate group entirely, one that operated with a degree of secrecy and specialized, closely guarded knowledge unmatched by almost any other profession in ancient Egypt. At the edge of the Valley of the Kings, and at similar sites throughout Egypt, archaeologists have identified the remains of structures known as Wabet buildings, or pure places. Dedicated workshops where the embalming process itself was carried out, physically separate from both the temples of the living gods and the tombs of the dead, existing in a kind of liminal space between the two. The most extensively studied of these, uncovered relatively recently near the Valley of the Kings, revealed not just the physical workspace itself, but material evidence of the substances and processes used there. Large ceramic vessels bearing residue analysis consistent with specific embalming materials, and inscriptions naming particular resins, oils, and treatments used at different stages of the process. The basic outline of Egyptian mummification is documented with unusual clarity for an ancient practice, thanks largely to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and recorded a detailed, if not entirely error-free account of the embalming process as it was described to him, alongside physical and chemical analysis of surviving mummies themselves, which has allowed modern researchers to verify, correct, and expand on his account considerably. We know the internal organs were removed, with the heart typically left in place due to its believed role in the deceased's final judgment. We know the body was desiccated using natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, over a period of roughly 40 days, before being anointed, packed, and wrapped in linen across a process that could extend the full preparation period to around 70 days in total. We know specific organs were preserved separately in canopic jars, each associated with a particular protective deity. This much represents genuinely settled history, confirmed repeatedly through both ancient testimony and modern forensic examination. What remains considerably less settled is the internal structure and knowledge transmission of the profession responsible for carrying all of this out. Unlike scribes, whose training we can trace with real specificity through the House of Life and its associated educational literature, or priests, whose ranks and titles appear extensively across temple records, embalmers occupied a genuinely unusual position within Egyptian society, simultaneously essential to the entire religious and funerary system that defined Egyptian civilization, and yet comparatively obscure in terms of how the profession itself was organized, trained, and regulated. Part of this obscurity likely reflects the profession's specific relationship to ritual purity and physical contamination. Embalmers worked directly with human remains during a period of decomposition the Egyptians themselves regarded with considerable unease, despite the sacred importance of the work being performed. Herodotus himself recorded a detail that later evidence has generally supported: that certain embalmers, specifically those responsible for the initial, most invasive stages of the process involving direct contact with the body's interior, were regarded with a degree of social distance even by their own colleagues, required to flee the immediate area after performing their specific portion of the ritual, pursued briefly by mock threats and curses from other members of the embalming team, in what appears to have been a ritualized acknowledgement of the profession's uncomfortable relationship with the pollution associated with death, even as its ultimate purpose was considered sacred and necessary. This detail alone suggests a profession with internal hierarchies and specific role divisions considerably more elaborate than the relatively undifferentiated picture embalmer might initially suggest. Some roles within the process were seemingly considered more spiritually fraught than others, and the profession appears to have developed its own internal rituals specifically to manage that discomfort, distinct from the broader funerary rituals performed for the deceased themselves. How was this internal structure organized? Who determined which practitioners performed which specific tasks? And how was that knowledge passed down across generations, given how comparatively little direct textual evidence survives describing the profession's own internal training and organization, compared to what we have for scribes or priests? The mainstream historical answer acknowledges this gap honestly. Embalming knowledge was almost certainly passed down through direct apprenticeship, likely often within specific families or hereditary lineages, following a pattern common to specialized craft professions throughout the ancient world, where practical technique was taught through hands-on training rather than extensive written instruction, and where whatever written material did exist may have been considered proprietary enough to warrant limited circulation outside the immediate professional community. This explanation is consistent with what little evidence survives, and it doesn't require anything unusual to account for the profession's comparative documentary obscurity. Specialized craft knowledge across many ancient cultures was frequently guarded closely by its practitioners, protecting both the economic value of scarce technical skill and, in this specific case, likely also managing the profession's uneasy relationship with ritual purity by controlling exactly who was permitted to perform which stages of a process considered simultaneously sacred and spiritually dangerous. This straightforward explanation, however, sits somewhat uncomfortably against a specific and genuinely puzzling aspect of Egyptian mummification's own history. Its methods appear to have improved, shifted, and in some cases become measurably more sophisticated across particular periods, most notably during parts of the New Kingdom, when techniques for preserving facial features and body proportions reached a level of anatomical fidelity that later periods, for reasons not fully understood, did not consistently maintain or improve upon further. If embalming knowledge was passed down primarily through informal apprenticeship within limited professional circles, why do we see periods of genuine technical advancement followed by periods of apparent decline or stagnation, rather than the more steady, cumulative refinement we might expect from a continuously operating, multi-generational craft tradition, steadily building on its own accumulated experience over nearly 3,000 years of continuous practice? Egyptologists studying this pattern generally point to broader historical disruptions, political instability, economic strain, foreign invasion, and shifts in royal patronage as sufficient explanation for periods of technical decline, noting that skilled craft knowledge, however carefully guarded and transmitted, remains vulnerable to genuine loss when the social and economic conditions supporting its practitioners break down significantly enough. This is a reasonable, historically grounded explanation, consistent with what we know happened to other specialized Egyptian professions during comparable periods of instability, including the scribal and priestly traditions we've discussed elsewhere in this series. It's within the specific gaps in this explanation, however, that more speculative interpretations of the embalming profession have found room to grow. A number of independent researchers, working outside conventional Egyptological frameworks, have proposed that certain highly specialized embalming techniques, particularly those associated with the most technically accomplished periods of mummification, may have been restricted to smaller, more tightly controlled circles of practitioners than the broader profession as a whole, functioning closer to a genuine guarded brotherhood than an open craft tradition, with specific advanced techniques deliberately withheld even from other embalmers outside a particular inner lineage, and lost more thoroughly when that specific lineage, for whatever reason, failed to successfully transmit its full body of knowledge to a new generation. There is no direct textual evidence confirming this more specific, tightly restricted structure, and mainstream Egyptology generally treats the broader apprenticeship model as sufficient to explain the patterns we observe. But the theory persists in certain circles specifically because the alternative, that the entire broadly practiced profession simply lost and partially regained specific technical skills repeatedly over centuries through ordinary historical disruption, doesn't fully satisfy everyone studying the specific quality fluctuations visible across the archaeological record. What we know with confidence is that mummification represented one of the most sustained, technically demanding, and religiously essential crafts ancient Egypt ever developed, practiced continuously for close to 3,000 years by practitioners whose own internal organization remains only partially reconstructed from the physical evidence of their work, rather than from any comprehensive account of the profession's inner structure written in their own words. The Waybet workshops still stand, at least in outline, at the edges of Egypt's great necropolises, their vessels and residues telling us a great deal about what was done inside them, and considerably less about exactly who was permitted to do it, how they came to possess that knowledge, and what, precisely, was lost each time a particular hand and the specific skill it carried went still. Every mystery in this series so far has had centuries, sometimes millennia, to accumulate its layer of speculation. This one didn't need nearly that long. It took less than a week in the summer of 2018 for a single black stone box, discovered by accident during ordinary construction work, to become a genuine worldwide viral phenomenon, complete with predictions of catastrophe circulating in the millions before anyone had even lifted the lid. The discovery itself happened in Alexandria, in a residential neighborhood undergoing routine building construction, when workers uncovered a massive granite sarcophagus buried roughly 17 feet below street level. At over 9 feet long and weighing an estimated 30 tons, it was and remains the largest sarcophagus of its kind ever discovered in Alexandria, carved entirely from black granite, sealed and undisturbed for what Egyptian antiquities officials estimated to be somewhere around 2,000 years, likely dating to the Ptolemaic period. Beside it, archaeologists found an alabaster head, presumably representing the sarcophagus's occupant, though its damaged, weathered features made specific identification difficult from the start. The find itself, while genuinely significant from an archaeological standpoint, was not initially expected to become the kind of story it turned into within days. That transformation began almost entirely online, as images and reports of the sarcophagus's sheer size and undisturbed condition spread rapidly across social media, accompanied by increasingly elaborate speculation about who or what might lie inside. Some posts suggested a connection to Alexander the Great himself, whose tomb has never been definitively located despite centuries of searching. A genuinely tantalizing possibility that, while considered unlikely by professional Egyptologists given the sarcophagus's Ptolemaic-era dating and Alexandria's known burial patterns from that period, was plausible enough on its surface to fuel serious public excitement. Other posts moved considerably further from historical plausibility, warning that opening the sarcophagus risked triggering some form of ancient curse or catastrophic consequence, a claim that spread with genuine intensity, generating online petitions specifically requesting that authorities leave the sarcophagus sealed rather than risk whatever consequence its opening might unleash. This is worth pausing on because it represents something distinct from most of the mysteries we've explored in this series. We are not examining an ancient inscription warning of consequences, carved by the Egyptians themselves and interpreted centuries or millennia later. We are examining a purely modern reaction, generated in real time, to an object whose contents were, at that specific moment, still genuinely unknown. A rare case where speculation and mystery preceded rather than followed the available evidence, compressed into a matter of days rather than centuries. Egyptian antiquities officials, for their part, moved forward with opening the sarcophagus, despite the online pressure to leave it sealed, framing the decision explicitly in scientific terms and pushing back publicly against the curse narrative that had attached itself to the discovery. When the seal was finally broken and the lid removed, the sarcophagus was found to contain the skeletal remains of 3 individuals, submerged in a reddish-brown liquid that had accumulated inside the sealed container over roughly 2,000 years. Most likely sewage water that had seeped in through cracks in the stone during the site's long burial beneath what had, by modern times, become residential infrastructure. Forensic analysis of the remains suggested at least one of the 3 individuals had suffered some form of head trauma prior to death, based on damage observed to one of the skulls, though the specific circumstances behind that injury and the identities or relationships of the three individuals interred together remain unclear and are unlikely to be definitively resolved given the limitations of the surviving physical evidence. This is, by any reasonable measure, an entirely mundane conclusion to what had briefly been treated online as a potentially world-altering event. No curse manifested. No catastrophic consequence followed the sarcophagus's opening. The reality, as is so often the case with ancient discoveries, proved considerably less dramatic than the speculation that preceded it. Three individuals, buried together for reasons we can't fully reconstruct, sealed inside an impressively large and well-crafted stone container that ultimately told us less about its occupants than its own sheer physical scale had initially promised. And yet, the incident itself remains worth examining carefully, not because the sarcophagus turned out to hold some genuine ancient secret after all, but because of what the entire episode reveals about the persistent, evidently universal human impulse to project mystery and consequence onto sealed ancient objects, even in an era of instant global communication and immediate scientific verification. Why did this particular discovery, among the many significant archaeological finds made in Egypt during any given year, capture public imagination so intensely and so quickly? Part of the answer likely lies in the sarcophagus's specific physical characteristics, its size, its material, its color, all combining to produce an object that looked, to a casual modern viewer scrolling through social media, precisely like the kind of ominous, foreboding artifact that decades of popular media, much of it drawing loosely and often inaccurately on the very curse narratives we examined earlier in this series regarding Tutankhamun's tomb, had already primed audiences to expect. This raises a genuinely interesting question about the relationship between ancient Egyptian mystery and its modern reception, one that applies well beyond this single incident. How much of what circulates today as ancient Egyptian mystery reflects genuine unresolved questions rooted in the historical and archaeological record of the kind we've explored throughout this series? The missing name of Ra, the silence at Hermopolis, the unresolved fate of Akhenaten's priesthood, and how much of it reflects a modern, largely self-generated narrative tradition built up over more than a century of popular media that we now project reflexively onto any sufficiently large, sufficiently dark, sufficiently old object pulled from Egyptian soil, regardless of what that specific object's own archaeological context actually suggests. The Black Sarcophagus of Alexandria offers a rare, almost clinical case study in how quickly and completely that projection can occur, and how thoroughly it can dissolve once the actual evidence becomes available. Within roughly a week, an object went from anonymous burial to viral apocalyptic symbol to fully documented, scientifically explained archaeological find, its contents examined, catalogued, and ultimately found to be exactly as historically plausible and comparatively unremarkable as most sealed ancient containers eventually proved to be, once opened under proper conditions. This doesn't mean every claim of ancient Egyptian mystery deserves the same swift dismissal the sarcophagus's curse narrative ultimately received. Many of the questions raised earlier in this series remain genuinely open, supported by real gaps in the archaeological and textual record that professional Egyptologists themselves acknowledge as unresolved. But the sarcophagus incident offers a useful, recent point of comparison. A reminder that not every shadow cast by an ancient object reflects something the object itself is actually hiding, and that the line between a genuine historical mystery and a modern narrative built rapidly around an unfamiliar shape in the sand isn't always as easy to identify in the moment as it becomes once the lid has finally been lifted and the light let back in. The sarcophagus itself remains in Egyptian custody today, its immediate mystery resolved, its three occupants still largely unidentified, their specific story lost to a burial context that simple physical examination could only partially reconstruct. Whether anything genuinely significant about who they were and why they came to share that particular stone container will ever be more fully understood is a far quieter question than the one the internet asked in 2018. But it may, in the end, be the only question this particular black sarcophagus was ever actually capable of answering. The black sarcophagus taught us something important about how quickly modern imagination fills a vacuum once genuine evidence is delayed. But there's a different, older kind of unease that has surrounded Egypt's necropolises for far longer than social media has existed. One rooted not in a single sealed object, but in the land itself, and in a belief so old and so consistently reported across so many centuries that it predates modern archaeology entirely. The west bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes, has functioned as sacred burial ground for the living to place their dead since Egypt's earliest dynastic periods, and it remained in continuous use as a necropolis for well over 2,000 years. The Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, the Theban necropolis more broadly, along with the workers' village of Deir el-Medina that housed the artisans responsible for constructing these tombs. Together, this entire western landscape represents one of the largest, longest-used burial complexes in human history. A stretch of arid hills and hidden valleys, chosen deliberately by the Egyptians for its specific relationship to the setting sun, and by extension, to the realm of the dead the sun was believed to enter each night. This choice of location wasn't incidental or purely practical. Egyptian cosmology consistently associated the West with death and the underworld, since this was the direction in which the sun visibly departed the world of the living each evening, journeying, according to Egyptian religious belief, through the dangerous, chaotic realm of the Duat before its rebirth at dawn. Placing the dead specifically on the Nile's western bank wasn't simply about available land or geological suitability, though the region's dry limestone hills did offer genuinely practical advantages for tomb construction and long-term body preservation. It was also a deliberate act of religious geography, situating the deceased along the same symbolic path the sun god himself was believed to travel each night. Given this deliberate, sustained religious significance, it's perhaps unsurprising that the Western necropolis has generated its own extensive body of reported unusual experiences among the workers, guards, and researchers who have spent time there, particularly in its more remote and less frequently visited corners, away from the well-lit, heavily trafficked paths connecting the valley's most famous tombs. What sets this body of reports apart from similar accounts we discussed earlier regarding Karnak is both its geographic breadth, spanning an entire necropolis landscape rather than a single temple complex, and its specific character, which tends to center less on sound, as we found at Karnak, and more on visual phenomena and a persistent, widely reported sense of directional disorientation experienced by people traveling through the valley's more isolated stretches, particularly around dusk. Local guides and workers at the site, some from families with generations of direct involvement in Egyptian excavation work stretching back to the early days of modern archaeology in the region, have long described specific areas within the broader necropolis where visitors and even experienced local residents report becoming disoriented despite genuinely familiar terrain, along with occasional reports of indistinct human figures glimpsed at a distance in the hills surrounding the main valley floor, particularly in the transitional light of early morning or late afternoon. These accounts predate modern tourism considerably, appearing in the personal writings and correspondence of 19th and early 20th century excavators working in the region during a period when the valley's more remote areas remained genuinely isolated, sparsely populated, and largely unmapped compared to their current, thoroughly surveyed condition. The straightforward explanation for the disorientation reports carries real, well-supported weight. The Theban hills present a genuinely challenging landscape for navigation, characterized by repetitive limestone formations, numerous similar-looking valleys and side ravines, and dramatic shifts in available light and shadow as the sun moves across a landscape with limited vegetation to provide fixed visual reference points. Modern hikers and researchers unfamiliar with the specific terrain continue to report genuine difficulty maintaining orientation in certain sections of the broader necropolis, even with modern mapping technology available, a pattern consistent with straightforward, well-documented environmental factors, rather than anything requiring supernatural explanation. Desert environments generally, and this specific limestone terrain in particular, are well known among search and rescue professionals worldwide for producing genuine, measurable disorientation effects in even experienced travelers. Through a combination of visual repetition, temperature-related heat distortion, and the simple absence of the kind of varied landmarks most people rely on unconsciously for spatial orientation. The reported figures glimpsed at a distance admit a similarly grounded explanation. Heat shimmer, a well-documented optical phenomenon caused by temperature gradients near the ground surface, is capable of producing genuinely convincing illusions of movement and human-like shapes at a distance, particularly during the specific transitional lighting conditions most consistently associated with these reports. Combined with the psychological expectation any visitor to a 2,000-year-old burial ground might reasonably bring with them, particularly one as culturally saturated with mystery and reverence as the Valley of the Kings, these environmental factors offer a coherent, evidence-consistent account of why such reports would recur so persistently across generations of visitors, with no direct knowledge of each other's experiences. This explanation, while genuinely sufficient to account for a significant portion of the reported phenomena, doesn't fully close every specific detail found in the historical record of these accounts, particularly regarding their remarkable consistency in describing the reported figures' apparent behavior. Multiple, independently recorded accounts across different eras describe these distant figures not simply appearing and vanishing in the manner heat shimmer would typically produce, but specifically moving in directions and patterns that witnesses describe as purposeful, sometimes appearing to walk along routes that align with known ancient processional paths connecting specific tomb sites, paths that in several cases weren't rediscovered or clearly mapped by archaeologists until well after the relevant reports had already been recorded. This detail, while impossible to verify rigorously given the anecdotal nature of the source material, has drawn genuine attention from researchers who note that heat shimmer and simple pattern-matching psychology, while sufficient to explain isolated sightings, don't obviously account for why witnesses across different periods would consistently describe movement aligning with specific ancient routes that weren't part of common public knowledge at the time the accounts were recorded. Mainstream archaeology and psychology offer a reasonable response to even this more specific pattern, suggesting that the ancient processional paths in question, while not formally mapped or published in academic literature until later periods, may have remained visible to some degree as subtle landscape features, slight variations in terrain, ancient wear patterns, or other physical traces detectable, consciously or unconsciously, by observers spending extended time in the landscape, even without formal archaeological documentation confirming their historical significance. This remains a plausible, evidence-grounded explanation, requiring nothing beyond ordinary human perception responding to genuine, if subtle, physical landscape features that predate their formal academic identification. It's in the space this explanation doesn't fully occupy that more speculative interpretations have taken hold, echoing similar territory we explored regarding Karnak's reported chanting. Some researchers, working outside conventional academic frameworks, have suggested that a landscape maintained continuously as sacred burial ground for well over 2 millennia, host to countless funerary processions, rituals, and the sustained religious attention of generations who genuinely believed this specific terrain connected directly to the realm of the dead, might retain some form of accumulated significance detectable by those moving through it, independent of any conventional physical or psychological mechanism currently available to test the claim. This remains, as with comparable claims examined elsewhere in this series, an unfalsifiable position rather than a testable hypothesis, and it carries no acceptance within mainstream archaeology or the broader scientific community studying human perception and environmental psychology. What remains beyond dispute is that this landscape has drawn sustained, consistent, and remarkably similar reports of disorientation and distant, purposeful-seeming movement from generations of people with genuinely little reason to coordinate their accounts with each other, spanning a period considerably longer than modern tourism, modern archaeology, or even, in its earliest recorded instances, modern photography and mapping technology. The hills themselves remain exactly where the Egyptians placed their dead, arid, and largely unchanged beneath a sun that still sets, each evening, in precisely the direction their entire religious cosmology once organized itself around. Whether anything besides heat, light, and the very human tendency to see meaning in unfamiliar terrain still moves along those ancient processional paths. After the tour buses have gone, is a question the Western necropolis has never needed modern technology to keep asking, long before anyone arrived with the tools to try answering it. The Western necropolis holds its silence about what may or may not still move through it. But not every ancient Egyptian mystery involves absence and ambiguity. Some come to us in full narrative detail, preserved deliberately as protective magic meant to be recited word for word. And this next one begins with a goddess in genuine danger, fleeing across a landscape that offered her no protection at all, except 7 small, venomous companions. The story of the 7 scorpions survives most completely in a text known as the Metternich Stela, a remarkable object now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, carved during the 4th century BC, but almost certainly preserving considerably older material, structured specifically as a healing and protective monument meant to treat scorpion and snake bites through both ritual recitation and, in some interpretations, direct physical contact with water poured over its inscribed surface before being given to a suffering patient to drink. The stela belongs to a broader category of Egyptian magical objects known as kipi, typically featuring a central image of the child god Horus, standing atop crocodiles while grasping dangerous animals in each hand, surrounded by dense inscriptions combining mythological narrative with specific magical formulas intended for practical medical use. Among the mythological content inscribed on the Metternich Stela and related texts is the story that gives this chapter its name. Following the murder of Osiris by his brother Set, the goddess Isis, pregnant with Horus, is forced to flee into hiding to protect both herself and her unborn son from Set's continued hostility. According to the text, 7 scorpions accompanied her during this period of flight, acting as protectors and lookouts as she moved through hostile territory, their names individually recorded within the surviving text as Tefen, Befen, Mestet, Mestatef, Petet, Thetet, and Matet. The narrative continues with Isis and her scorpion companions eventually seeking shelter for the night at the home of a wealthy woman, who refuses them entry, apparently frightened by the sight of the scorpions accompanying her. A poorer woman nearby offers Isis shelter instead. In response to the wealthy woman's rejection, one of the scorpions, Tefin, sneaks beneath the door of her house and stings her infant son, who begins dying from the venom. Isis, moved by compassion despite the wealthy woman's earlier cruelty, uses her magical power to heal the child, reciting a series of formulas that identify and neutralize the poison, restoring the boy to full health. The wealthy woman, transformed by this act of mercy shown to her despite her own inhospitality, is said to have repented and made offerings to the poorer woman who had originally sheltered Isis. This much represents the surviving narrative core of the myth, preserved with enough textual consistency across multiple related magical objects and papyri that Egyptologists consider it a well-established piece of Egyptian mythological and medical magical tradition, rather than an isolated or uncertain literary fragment. Its practical medical application is equally well documented. The specific healing formulas embedded within the Isis and Scorpions narrative were clearly intended for direct ritual use, recited by practitioners treating actual scorpion sting victims, with the mythological narrative itself functioning as a kind of sympathetic template. The healing that worked for the wealthy woman's son in the mythological past was believed capable of working again, through proper recitation, for any present-day victim facing the same danger. This straightforward reading accounts for a great deal of what the text preserves, and mainstream Egyptology treats the 7 Scorpions narrative as a genuinely well-understood example of Egyptian magico-medical practice, blending mythology and practical healing technique in a manner consistent with what we've already discussed regarding the close relationship between medicine and magic within institutions like the House of Life. Scorpion stings represented a genuine, significant medical danger in ancient Egypt, and a healing tradition built around a sympathetic mythological narrative, reinforced by ritual recitation and specific formulaic language, fits comfortably within broader ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern approaches to venom treatment, many of which similarly combine practical herbal knowledge with ritual or religious framing. Where the narrative grows more difficult to fully account for within this practical medical framework is in the specific detail of the number 7 itself, and the individually recorded names given to each scorpion, details that exceed what a purely functional healing formula would seem to strictly require. Why assign distinct, individually memorable names to 7 separate scorpions, when a single symbolic protective animal, or an unnamed collective group, could have served an equivalent narrative and ritual purpose with considerably less specific detail to preserve and transmit accurately across generations of ritual practitioners? Egyptian religious and magical tradition frequently employed specific numerical symbolism, and the number 7 in particular carried recognized significance within Egyptian cosmology, appearing in other mythological and ritual contexts throughout Egyptian history in ways that suggest deliberate numerological weight rather than arbitrary narrative detail. This numerological explanation accounts reasonably well for the choice of 7 scorpions specifically, without requiring anything beyond established patterns of Egyptian symbolic thought. The individual names themselves present a slightly more specific puzzle. Egyptologists have worked to translate and interpret each name's meaning, with varying degrees of confidence and scholarly agreement, generally finding that they relate to qualities or actions associated with the scorpion's protective role, though the precise nuance of each name and why these particular 7 terms were selected, rather than alternative options that might have conveyed similar protective qualities, remains a subject of ongoing philological discussion rather than fully settled translation. This level of interpretive uncertainty is common across ancient Egyptian textual analysis generally, and doesn't in itself suggest anything beyond the ordinary challenges of translating a language whose full semantic range, particularly regarding specialized ritual and mythological vocabulary, remains incompletely reconstructed even after more than a century of dedicated scholarship. It's within this space of specific interpretive uncertainty, layered onto the mythological narrative's evident practical medical function, that a smaller set of more speculative readings has emerged. Some researchers, working somewhat outside the strict philological and medical historical mainstream of Egyptological scholarship, have proposed that the 7 named scorpions may represent something closer to a structured symbolic taxonomy of specific venom effects or bodily responses recognized by ancient Egyptian medical practitioners, with each name and its associated narrative role potentially encoding practical diagnostic or treatment information beyond what a purely mythological or numerologically symbolic reading would suggest. This interpretation remains unproven and is not the position favored by mainstream Egyptology, which generally treats the specific names as meaningful primarily within their narrative and protective magical context, rather than as an encoded medical classification system. But the theory persists in certain circles specifically because ancient Egyptian medical texts elsewhere, including material associated with the Ebers papyrus we discussed earlier in this series, do demonstrate a genuine capacity for systematic, almost clinical categorization of symptoms and treatments, existing comfortably alongside explicitly magical and mythological framing within the very same documents. Whether that same systematic impulse extended specifically into this particular narrative structure remains an open, largely unresolved question rather than an established finding. What the Metternich stela and its related texts preserve in the end is a myth that functions simultaneously as sacred narrative and practical medicine, treating Isis's flight and her scorpion's protective role not as separate from the physical danger of an actual venomous sting, but as directly, ritually connected to it, a healing that worked once in elude tempus and could be made to work again through correct recitation in the present. Whether the specific details preserved within that narrative, the number of protectors, their individual names, their precise sequence of actions, represent purely symbolic and mythological choices, or something closer to a more systematic body of practical knowledge encoded into story form for easier preservation and transmission, is a question the stela itself, for all its careful detail, was never designed to answer directly. It was designed to heal, not to explain itself to us, 3,000 years after the last practitioner who fully understood every choice embedded within its careful, deliberate text.